The year is 1865. For 4 long, brutal years, the United States has been a nation at war with itself. Brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. The American Civil War, a conflict that tore the very fabric of the country apart, is finally drawing to a close. The guns are falling silent. The smoke is beginning to clear. But the silence that follows is not one of peace. It's unairy, heavy silence, filled with the echoes of cannon fire and the ghosts of over 600,000 souls. Imagine standing in the heart of what was once a bustling city. Look around you. The buildings are skeletal remains, blackened by fire. Their windows like hollow eyes staring out at a landscape of desolation. Streets that once thronged with life are now choked with rubble and debris. This was the reality for cities like Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy, and Atlanta, Georgia, which lay in smoldering ruins. The physical destruction was immense, a visible scar carved across the American landscape. The war had not just been fought on battlefields, it had been waged on the very homes and livelihoods of its people. But the visible wounds, as horrific as they were only part of the story. The deeper, more painful wounds were the ones you couldn't see. Families were fractured, often irrevocably. Fathers and sons had fought on opposing sides, their letters home filled with a strange mix of love and ideological fury. Friendships that had been forged over a lifetime were shattered by the deep chasm of political division over slavery and states' rights. In homes across the nation, from the farms of Vermont to the plantations of Mississippi, there were empty chairs at the dinner table, permanent reminders of the conflict's human cost. The emotional toll was staggering. A generation of young men was lost. Many who did return were forever changed, carrying both physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. The nation was exhausted, emotionally drained, and grieving on a scale it had never known before. With the surrender of General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse in April, the military conflict was essentially over. The Union was preserved, but as the flags of surrender were being folded, a monumental question began to loom over everyone. From the highest corridors of power in Washington, D.C. to the smallest, most remote towns. What now? How does a country begin to heal after tearing itself apart? How do you rebuild not just the cities and the farms, but the very soul of the nation? This wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about redefining what it meant to be an American. The central issue that had ignited the war slavery had been addressed by President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the impending passage of the 13th Amendment, which would formally abolish it. But freeing nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans was only the first step. What would their status be in this newly reunited nation? Would they be citizens with full rights? How would they be integrated into society and the economy? These were questions with no easy answers, and they would ignite fierce debates that would shape the next chapter of American history. And what about the defeated South? How should the Confederate States be brought back into the Union? Should they be treated as conquered territories, punished for their rebellion, or should they be welcomed back with a spirit of reconciliation and forgiveness? This was the core of the debate over Reconstruction. President Lincoln had favored a lenient approach, a malice toward none, with charity for all path, hoping to bind up the nation's wounds as quickly as possible. His 10% plan was designed for a swift and merciful reunion. But Lincoln's vision was tragically cut short, just days after Lee's surrender. On the evening of April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth assassinated the president at Ford's Theater. The nation, already reeling, was plunged into even deeper shock and grief. With Lincoln gone, the task of overseeing Reconstruction fell to his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Johnson, a Southerner himself who had remained loyal to the Union, had his own ideas about how to rebuild. His approach was different from Lincoln's, and it would soon bring him into direct conflict with a group in Congress known as the Radical Republicans. These congressmen believed that the South needed to be fundamentally transformed and that the federal government had a moral obligation to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans. They saw Johnson's plans as far too lenient on the former Confederates and inadequate for protecting the freedmen. This clash of ideologies would set the stage for a political battle that would define the era. So, as 1865 dawned, America was at a crossroads. The war was over, but the peace was fragile and uncertain. The nation had survived its greatest test, but it emerged from the crucible of war a different country. The old order was shattered. The air was filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. Hope for a new beginning, for a nation truly conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, but also apprehension about the immense challenges that lay ahead. The questions were monumental. How do you mend a broken family? How do you rebuild trust where there has been betrayal? How do you forge a single national identity out of two warring factions? The end of the Civil War was not an end to the struggle. It was the beginning of a new one. It was the start of a long, difficult, and often painful journey to define the future of the United States. The answers to the questions raised in the ashes of 1865 would shape the country for decades, even centuries, to come. The fight for the soul of America was far from over. It was just entering a new, critical chapter. This is the story of Reconstruction, the period when a wounded nation tried to rise from the ashes and truly become, for the first time, the United States. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to 1865. This is just the beginning of an incredible story of struggle, hope, and transformation. If you want to find out what happens next, how the battles in Congress played out, how life changed for millions of newly freed people, and how the nation grappled with its own identity make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We've got so much more to explore together. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter. Hey everyone, welcome back to our series on American history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 2. What was Reconstruction? If you've ever heard this term and wondered what it was all about, you're in the right place. Simply put, Reconstruction was the period right after the American Civil War, from roughly 1865 to 1877. But it was so much more than just a block of time on a calendar. Imagine a country literally torn in two by 4 years of brutal conflict. The war was over, but the United States was broken. The southern states were in ruins, and millions of formerly enslaved African Americans were now free. The big question on everyone's mind was, now what? How do you put a shattered nation back together? That's what Reconstruction tried to answer. So, when we talk about rebuilding, it wasn't just about bricks and mortars. It was a massive undertaking on 3 major fronts: political, social, and economic. Let's start with the political side. The Confederate States had seceded. They had left the Union. So, a huge debate erupted. How should these states be Should they be welcomed back with open arms, or should they be punished for the rebellion? President Abraham Lincoln had favored a more lenient approach, what was known as the 10% plan. But after his assassination, the situation became way more complicated. Congress, led by a group called the Radical Republicans, wanted stricter conditions. They believed the federal government needed to take a strong hand to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans and to fundamentally transform Southern society. This led to a major power struggle between President Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, and Congress. It was a battle over who really had the authority to direct the course of Reconstruction. The political fights were intense, leading to new amendments to the Constitution and even the impeachment of a president. Next, let's talk about the social rebuilding, which is arguably the most profound and challenging aspect of Reconstruction. For the first time in American history, nearly 4 million people were no longer considered property. They were citizens. This was a revolutionary social shift. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was just the beginning. The central social question of Reconstruction was, what does freedom mean for African Americans? Does it just mean not being a slave, or does it mean having the same rights and opportunities as white citizens? This is where the 14th and 15th Amendments come in. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection of the laws to anyone born in the United States, including former slaves. The 15th Amendment declared that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. These were monumental steps forward on paper. For a brief, hopeful period, African Americans actively participated in the political process. They voted, ran for office, and were elected to local, state, and even national positions. Black men served in Congress and state legislatures. Institutions like the Freedmen's Bureau were established to help with education, housing, and finding work. Schools and universities for African Americans were founded, many of which still exist today. It was a time of incredible hope and progress, an attempt to build a truly biracial democracy from the ashes of a slave society. Finally, we have the economic rebuilding. The South's economy had been devastated by the war. Its entire economic system was built on enslaved labor, and now that was gone. The infrastructure, railroads, bridges, farms was destroyed. So, the economic challenge was twofold. How do you rebuild the Southern economy? And how do you integrate 4 million newly freed people into a free labor system? One attempt to solve this was sharecropping. In theory, it was supposed to give families a piece of land to farm in exchange for a share of the crop. But in practice, it often trapped both black and poor white farmers in a cycle of debt and poverty, tied to the same land they had worked on as slaves. There were also efforts to industrialize the South, to create a new South with more factories and a diversified economy. But change was slow, and many wealthy white Southerners were determined to restore the old social and economic order as much as possible. The economic struggles of this era set the stage for decades of poverty and inequality in the region. So why do these 12 years, from 1865 to 1877, matter so much? Because this period was America's first real attempt to grapple with the meaning of freedom and equality for all its citizens. The questions raised during Reconstruction are questions we are still debating today. Questions about federal power versus states' rights, about who gets to be a citizen, who gets to vote, and what racial justice really looks like. It was a time of incredible progress and heartbreaking failure. The promises of Reconstruction were powerful, but the backlash was fierce. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and terror to intimidate black voters and their white allies, seeking to re-establish white dominance. By 1877, a series of political compromises led to the federal government pulling its troops out of the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. This withdrawal left African Americans at the mercy of state governments that quickly passed discriminatory laws, known as Jim Crow laws, which would enforce racial segregation and disenfranchisement for nearly another century. Understanding Reconstruction is crucial because it's not just a closed chapter of the past. It was a critical turning point that shaped the course of American race relations, politics, and society for the next 100 years and beyond. It was a period that saw the Constitution fundamentally rewritten to include promises of equality, but it also saw the failure of the nation to live up to those promises. It shows us how fragile progress can be and how powerful the struggle for justice has always been. By studying this era, we can better understand the roots of many of the social and political issues we face in the present day. It's a complex, often painful, but absolutely essential part of the American story. Thanks so much for watching this deep dive into Reconstruction. I know it's a lot to take in, but it's a story that needs to be told. If you found this helpful, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll be exploring the rise of Jim Crow and the Gilded Age. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the Reconstruction era. In this chapter, we're journeying into the heart of the post-war South, a land utterly transformed and broken by 4 years of brutal conflict. Imagine a landscape where the familiar sights and sounds of daily life have been replaced by silence and ruin. This was the reality for millions of people across the former Confederacy in 1865. The war wasn't just a series of battles. It was a cataclysm that shattered the very foundation of Southern society. Let's start by painting a picture of the physical devastation. The infrastructure that had once been the lifeblood of the Southern economy was now in shambles. Think about the railroads. These were the arteries of commerce, carrying cotton, tobacco, and other goods to ports and markets. Now, they were a twisted mess of metal and charred wood. Tracks had been ripped up, often heated and bent around trees in a mocking gesture known as Sherman's neckties. Bridges were gone, dynamited into rivers, cutting off vital connections between communities. Train depots, once bustling with activity, were now just hollowed out, burnt shells. Without a functioning rail system, the South was paralyzed. It was nearly impossible to move food, supplies, or people over long distances, isolating towns and making the task of rebuilding seem insurmountable. And it wasn't just the railroads. The entire agricultural system, the backbone of the Southern economy, had collapsed. Farms that had been in families for generations were now desolate wastelands. Fences were torn down, fields were overgrown with weeds, or scarred by trenches and earthworks. Barns, once filled with harvests, had been burned to the ground. Livestock, crucial for plowing fields, and providing food had been confiscated or killed by foraging armies from both sides. Major agricultural centers, like the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, had been systematically targeted and destroyed to cripple the South's ability to feed its armies and its people. For the farmers who returned, there were no seeds to plant, no tools to work the land, and no animals to help them. The very earth seemed to have been salted. This destruction extended deep into the cities and towns. Places like Richmond, the Confederate capital, were a sea of ruins. A massive fire during the evacuation had consumed its entire commercial district, leaving behind a haunting forest of brick chimneys and blackened walls. Charleston, South Carolina, a symbol of secessionist pride, had been under siege for years, its beautiful architecture pockmarked by artillery shells. Atlanta, a crucial industrial and transportation hub, had been famously put to the torch by General Sherman's army. The destruction was strategic, aimed at breaking not just the South's military capacity, but also its will to resist. In town after town, from Columbia to Mobile, the story was the same. Banks were looted, factories were dismantled, and homes were ransacked. The landscape was littered with the ghosts of a former life. Beyond the physical ruin, there was a profound human cost. The numbers are staggering. Millions of people, both black and white, were suddenly adrift in a world of profound uncertainty. Let's first consider the newly freed African Americans, about 4 million of them. Emancipation was a moment of incredible joy and hope, the dawn of a new freedom they had long prayed for. But it was also a moment of immense vulnerability. They were free, but what did that freedom mean in practice? They had no land, no money, no education, and very few legal protections. Many left the plantations where they had been enslaved, searching for family members who had been sold away years or even decades before. The roads were filled with people on foot, carrying everything they owned, desperate to reunite with loved ones and start a new life. But where could they go? What could they do? They faced a society that was still deeply hostile to their very existence, and the path ahead was fraught with danger and poverty. At the same time, a huge portion of the white Southern population was also facing destitution. The planter aristocracy, the wealthy elite who had dominated Southern society and politics, saw their entire world crumble. Their wealth wasn't just in land. It was primarily in the enslaved people they owned. With emancipation, that wealth vanished overnight. Confederate bonds and currency were now worthless pieces of paper. Many who had lived in mansions were now impoverished, struggling to even feed their families. But the suffering wasn't confined to the rich. The vast majority of white Southerners were small farmers, not slave owners. They had sacrificed immensely for the war effort. A quarter of all white men of military age in the South had died in the conflict. Those who returned came home wounded, often to find their farms destroyed and their families in desperate need. They had fought for a cause that was now lost, and they returned to a homeland that was economically and spiritually shattered. For them, the defeat was a source of deep bitterness and humiliation, feelings that would fester and shape the politics of the region for decades to come. This widespread poverty created a humanitarian crisis on an unprecedented scale. Starvation was a real and present danger. In the immediate aftermath of the war, people survived on whatever they could find. Food riots broke out in some cities. The U.S. government, through the Army and the newly formed Freedmen's Bureau, tried to distribute emergency rations of food and clothing to both blacks and whites to prevent mass starvation. But the scale of the need was simply overwhelming. There was no social safety net, no welfare system. So, as we move forward in our story, it's crucial to hold this image in our minds. A broken landscape, not just physically, but also psychologically and socially. The South was a region haunted by the ghosts of war, grappling with a revolution in its social order, and facing a future that was terrifyingly uncertain. The grand political debates happening in Washington about how to reconstruct the nation were not abstract theories for the people on the ground. For them, Reconstruction was a daily struggle for survival, an attempt to build a new life from the ashes of the old. How would they rebuild their towns and farms? How would 4 million formerly enslaved people define and defend their freedom? And how would a defeated and embittered white population come to terms with a new reality? These are the questions that will drive the dramatic, often violent, and ultimately transformative story of Reconstruction. The devastation of 1865 was the starting point for one of the most turbulent and important chapters in American history. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter, where we'll explore the immediate political responses to this crisis. Imagine, for a moment, that everything you've ever known has been turned upside down. The chains, both literal and invisible, that have bound you and your ancestors for generations, have suddenly shattered. This is the world of 1865, the dawn of emancipation for nearly 4 million African Americans. Today, we're diving deep into what that freedom truly meant. It wasn't just a legal document, it was a seismic shift in the very fabric of existence. Freedom. What a powerful word. For the newly emancipated, it was a concept they had dreamed of, prayed for, and fought for, but had never truly tasted. So, what did it mean in those first few moments? First and foremost, it meant mobility. For the first time, people could legally leave the plantations that had been their prisons. They could walk away from the fields, the overseer's whip, the constant surveillance, and simply choose a new direction. This wasn't just about travel. It was a profound act of self-determination. The ability to decide where your body would be was the most basic, yet most revolutionary, form of liberty. Another cornerstone of this newfound freedom was the sanctity of family. Under slavery, families were constantly torn apart at the whim of a master. Husbands sold away from wives, children ripped from their mother's arms, with no regard for the human bonds being severed. Emancipation sparked a desperate, continent-wide search. People walked hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles, putting up notices, asking strangers, holding on to faded memories, all in the hopes of reuniting with lost loved ones. Imagine the raw emotion of finding a spouse or a child after years, or even decades, of forced separation. These reunions were powerful testaments to the enduring strength of family and the deep human need for connection. Freedom meant the right to love and build a family without the constant fear of it being destroyed. It also meant a new identity. No longer were they property, listed in ledgers alongside livestock. They could choose their own names, shedding the names given to them by their enslavers and adopting names that symbolized their new status or honored their heritage. They could legally marry, a right previously denied, which legitimized their relationships and their children in the eyes of the law. This wasn't just paperwork. It was a declaration of personhood, an assertion that they were human beings with their own identities, worthy of respect and dignity. This wave of change was met with an explosion of emotions. There was, of course, overwhelming joy. You can picture the scenes. People singing, dancing, and celebrating in the streets. This was the Jubilee, the day of deliverance they had read about in the Bible. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated elation. Hope was a tangible force, a beacon shining brightly into a future that, for the first time, seemed to hold promise. The hope for education, for owning land, for participating in the society that had excluded them for so long. For the first time, they could dream of a better life for their children. But alongside this joy and hope, a cold current of fear and uncertainty ran deep. Think about it. You are set free, but you have nothing. No money, no property, often not even the clothes on your back. The world outside the plantation was entirely unknown. Where do you go? How do you eat? How do you provide for your family? This wasn't a cushioned transition. It was an abrupt drop into a new reality, filled with as many dangers as it had opportunities. This fear was not just economic. It was also physical. The same people who had enslaved them were still in power in many areas, and the resentment and violence from white Southerners who refused to accept this new order were immediate and brutal. Freedom was a precious, fragile thing that had to be guarded constantly. So, as we see, freedom was not a simple switch that was flipped. It was a complex, messy, and deeply personal journey. It was the joy of a family reunited, the pride of choosing one's own name, and the hope of a literate new generation. But it was also the gnawing anxiety of an empty stomach and the chilling fear of a hostile world. The promise of emancipation was immense, but the path to realizing that promise would be a long and arduous struggle. A struggle that would define the next chapter of American history. The first and most daunting challenge for the freedmen and women was economic survival. They had spent their lives creating immense wealth for others, but they themselves were left with nothing. The popular dream was for 40 acres and a mule, a prasedat, originated from General Sherman's Special Field Order. Non 15, this order set aside a huge tract of coastal land in the south for settlement by freed families. It represented the ultimate dream: economic independence. With your own land, you could feed your family, build a home, and escape the control of your former masters. It was the key to turning freedom from an abstract idea into a tangible reality. However, this promise was tragically short. After President Lincoln's assassination, his successor, Andrew Johnson, a Southerner sympathetic to the old planter class, overturned the order. The land was returned to its former Confederate owners. This was a devastating blow. It was a betrayal that snatched away the most realistic hope for self-sufficiency and sent a clear message. While you may be free, you would not be economically independent. The dream of 40 acres and a mule became a symbol of a promise broken, a deep wound that would have long-lasting consequences for generations. Without land, the vast majority of freed people were forced into a new system of economic dependency that looked alarmingly like the old one. This was shared. On the surface, it seemed like a step up. A landowner, often the former master, would provide a family with a plot of land, seeds, and tools. In return, the family would work the land, and at the end of the year, give a share of the crop, usually half, but sometimes more, to the owner. It offered a semblance of autonomy, as families worked their own plots without a driver or overseer. But in reality, sharecropping was a trap. The contracts were almost always verbal and controlled by the landowner. The sharecropper was often illiterate and couldn't dispute the terms. Furthermore, they had to buy food, clothing, and other necessities on credit from a local store, which was often owned by the landowner as well. The store charged outrageously high interest rates. So, at the end of the year, after the landowner took his half of the crop, the remaining half was often not enough to cover the debt. T-store. This is called debt penalty. The sharecropper would start the next year even deeper in debt, legally bound to work the same land to pay it off. It was a cycle of poverty and dependency, cleverly designed to keep a compliant, low-cost labor force tied to the land, ensuring the plantation economy could continue with minimal disruption. Freedom was the law, but for millions, the daily reality of sharecropping felt like a new form of slavery. In the face of these immense obstacles, the newly freed people showed incredible resilience and a thirst for self-improvement. One of the most powerful expressions of this was the pursuit of education. Under slavery, it was illegal in most states to teach an enslaved person to read or write. Literacy was seen as a tool of rebellion, a path to dangerous ideas of freedom. So, when emancipation came, the desire for education was explosive. People of all ages, from young children to elderly grandparents, flocked to makeshift schools. These schools were set up in any available space-abandoned buildings, church basements, even out in the open air. Northern aid societies, like the American Missionary Association and the federal government's own Freedmen's Bureau, sent teachers south and helped establish schools. But a huge part of the effort came from the African American community itself. They pooled their meager resources to buy land, build schoolhouses, and pay teachers' salaries. Reading was more than just a skill. It was an act of liberation. It allowed people to read the Bible for themselves, to read newspapers and understand the political world around them, to read contracts and protect themselves from being cheated. Education was the pathway to true freedom, a tool to empower themselves and build a better future for the next generation. It was a defiant act of community building and a testament to their unshakable belief in progress. Even in the face of so much adversity, another vital institution was the Black Church. During slavery, the church had been a sanctuary, one of the few spaces where African Americans could gather, express their shared faith, and develop their own community leaders. After emancipation, the church exploded in importance. It became the central pillar of the Black community. Thousands of new, independent Black churches were established across the South, free from white supervision. These churches were far more than just places of worship. They were the community center, the political meeting hall, the school, and the social safety net, all rolled into one. Pastors were not just spiritual guides. They were often the most educated and respected leaders in the community, organizing political action, mediating disputes, and leading the charge for civil rights. The church provided a space of psychological and emotional healing from the trauma of slavery. It was a place to affirm their humanity, organize for a better future, and sustain the hope that had carried them through the darkest of times. So, as we look back at this incredible moment in history, we see that emancipation was not an end point, but a starting point. It was the beginning of a new and difficult chapter in the American story. The promise of freedom was met with the harsh reality of economic exploitation and systemic barriers. Yet, in the face of these challenges, we see the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Through the relentless pursuit of education and the foundational strength of the church, newly freed African Americans began to lay the groundwork for their own communities and fight for the true meaning of freedom. Their struggle to turn the promise of emancipation into a lived reality is a story of hope, determination, and courage that continues to resonate today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this chapter of history as compelling as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that have shaped our world. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on the American Civil War and its aftermath. Today, we're diving into Chapter 5, exploring one of the most poignant what-ifs in American history, Abraham Lincoln's vision for healing a deeply fractured nation. As the Civil War neared its conclusion, the monumental question wasn't just about who won, but what came next. How could a country, torn apart by 4 years of brutal conflict, ever hope to become whole again? The task was immense, a challenge of reconstruction not just of cities and economies, but of the very soul of the nation. In the midst of this uncertainty, President Lincoln, the man who had steered the Union through its darkest hours, began to outline his plan for what would come to be known as Reconstruction. And his approach, as we'll see, was as remarkable as the man himself. It was a vision rooted not in punishment or retribution, but in a profound sense of mercy and a desperate hope for a lasting peace. So, let us explore the gentle hand Lincoln intended to offer his defeated countrymen and how he planned to bind up the nation's wounds. Before we get into the specifics of his plan, it's crucial to understand the atmosphere in early 1865. The war was winding down, and the Union victory was all but certain. In Washington and across the North, the mood was a volatile mix of relief, triumph, and a burning desire for vengeance. Many felt the South should pay dearly for the immense loss of life and treasure. Voices in Congress, particularly a group known as the Radical Republicans, were calling for harsh measures. They wanted to fundamentally transform Southern society, punish the Confederate leaders, and ensure that the old slaveholding aristocracy could never rise to power again. They saw this as a moment not just to end the war, but to win the peace by force, ensuring full civil rights for newly freed African Americans and breaking the power of the old guard for good. In this fiery climate of anger and retribution, Lincoln's perspective stood in stark, almost radical contrast. He believed that a punitive peace would only sow the seeds of future conflict. He understood that true reunification couldn't be achieved at the point of a bayonet. Lincoln had been thinking about reunion long before the final shots were fired. As early as December 1863, he introduced what became known as the 10% Plan. This plan was his initial blueprint for bringing Confederate states back into the fold, and it was astonishingly lenient. It stated that a Southern state could be readmitted into the Union once just 10% of its 1860 voter base took an oath of allegiance to the United States and pledged to abide by emancipation. Once that threshold was met, the state could form a new government and elect representatives to Congress. The plan also offered a full pardon to nearly all Confederates who took the oath, with the exception of high-ranking military and political leaders. Think about that for a moment. After years of bloody rebellion, Lincoln was asking for just 1/10 of the population to swear loyalty. He wasn't demanding that everyone repent. He was creating the lowest possible bar to begin the process of rebuilding. He believed that a swift and easy path back into the Union was the best way to encourage a quick end to the war and foster a spirit of reconciliation rather than prolonged bitterness. This wasn't about forgetting what happened, but about prioritizing the future of a united country over the punishment of a defeated enemy. This lenient approach, however, was not universally praised. The radical Republicans in Congress were against. They saw the 10% Plan as far too soft, a slap on the wrist for traitors. They feared it would allow the old Southern power structure to return, simply minus slavery, and do little to protect the rights and futures of the 4 million formerly enslaved people. In response, they passed their own, much stricter bill in 1864, the Wade-Davis Bill. This bill required that 50% of a state's white male citizens take an ironclad oath of past and future loyalty to the Union before the Reconstruction process could even begin. It also demanded that new state constitutions formally abolish slavery and disenfranchise Confederate leaders. The bill was designed to delay readmittance and ensure that a fundamental transformation occurred in the South. Lincoln, however, refused to sign it, using a pocket veto to kill the bill. He felt it was too punitive and would undermine his efforts to bring a swift, peaceful end to the conflict. This clash between the president and Congress highlighted the deep division over how to handle the defeated South and set the stage for a major political battle over the soul of Reconstruction. Lincoln wanted a fast, forgiving process. The radicals wanted a slow, revolutionary one. The clearest and most beautiful articulation of Lincoln's vision came on March 4, 1865. During his second inaugural address, standing on the steps of the Capitol, with the end of the war in sight, Lincoln delivered what is arguably one of the greatest speeches in American history. It was short, just over 700 words, and it wasn't a victory speech. It was a sermon. It was a plea for national healing. Instead of celebrating the Union's impending military triumph, Lincoln spoke with a tone of deep sorrow and humility. He suggested that the war was a divine punishment, a woe visited upon both North and South for the sin of slavery. He wasn't pointing fingers. He was casting a shared responsibility. He implied that the entire nation was culpable and that both sides had suffered under God's judgment. And then he delivered the lines that would define his entire approach to Reconstruction, words that echo to this day. He called on the nation to act with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let's break that down. With malice toward none, this was a direct rejection of the calls for vengeance and retribution. Lincoln was pleading for an end to the hatred that had fueled the war. He was asking the victorious North to resist the temptation to punish and instead embrace a spirit of forgiveness, with charity for all. This was the active component of his vision. It wasn't enough to simply not hate the South. The North had a moral obligation to help rebuild it, to care for the widows and orphans on both sides, to extend a hand of generosity. And finally, he concluded with the ultimate goal, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan. So, how did Lincoln intend to translate these beautiful words into concrete policy? His final days offer some tantalizing clues. In the last public address of his life, on April 11, 1865, just days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln spoke from a White House window to a crowd celebrating the Union victory. He specifically discussed the new government being formed in Louisiana under his 10% model. He said he was personally in favor of conferring the right to vote on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. He intended to use his presidential influence to guide the South toward a more just society, but through persuasion and incentive rather than through force and punishment. He worried that leaving them in a state of military-occupied limbo would only breed resentment and resistance, making long-term peace impossible. He believed that once these new governments were in place, progress on issues like civil rights could be made incrementally. His approach was a gamble. It gambled on the good faith of Southern whites and on his own ability to politically shepherd them towards a more inclusive future. It was a vision of reunion built on trust, forgiveness, and a shared desire to move forward. He saw the people of the South not as irredeemable enemies, but as fellow countrymen who had been led astray. His goal was to bring them back into the national family, to restore their sense of belonging, and to rebuild the shattered bonds of affection that had once held the country together. It was a profoundly optimistic, and perhaps even naive vision for a nation so deeply wounded by hatred and war. But of course, we will never know if Lincoln's gentle vision could have succeeded. Just 3 days after his speech on the Louisiana government, on the evening of April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater. His death was a national catastrophe, but it was an especially profound tragedy for the cause of a merciful peace. With Lincoln gone, the forces of retribution and anger he had tried so hard to restrain were unleashed. His successor, Andrew Johnson, lacked Lincoln's political skill, moral authority, and deep compassion. The radical Republicans in Congress, who had already viewed Lincoln's plan as too weak, saw his assassination as proof that the South was unrepentant and needed to be dealt with harshly. The dream of malice toward none died with Lincoln. What followed was a period of bitter conflict between President Johnson and Congress, leading to a much more stringent and confrontational form of Reconstruction. The path Lincoln had hoped to pave with forgiveness became a rocky road of military occupation, political struggle, and social upheaval. We are left to wonder, could Lincoln's magnanimity have healed the nation's wounds more effectively? Could his political genius have navigated the treacherous waters of Reconstruction, securing rights for the freedmen while also fostering reconciliation? It remains one of the great, unanswered questions of our history. Lincoln's vision for Reconstruction stands as a powerful testament to his character. At a moment when he could have rightfully claimed the spoils of victory and imposed a conqueror's peace, he chose the path of mercy. He understood a fundamental truth, that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and that forcing it together with bitterness and punishment would only ensure its eventual collapse. His plan was a bold attempt to transform enemies back into countrymen, to replace the anger of war with the charity of peace. While his untimely death prevented this vision from ever being fully realized, the principles he laid out in his final days, charity, and a commitment to a just and lasting peace, continue to inspire us. They serve as a timeless reminder that true strength is often found not in the power to punish, but in the grace to forgive. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. I hope it's given you a deeper appreciation for Lincoln's incredible foresight and character. Next time, we'll explore what actually happened after his death, as the nation embarked on the turbulent and controversial era of radical Reconstruction. It's a dramatic and crucial part of the story, so you won't want to miss it. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like, and be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into a pivotal and heart-wrenching moment in American history, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. This is Chapter 6, A Nation in Mourning. The year is 1865. The Civil War, a conflict that had torn the United States apart for 4 long, bloody years, was finally drawing to a close. On April 9th, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse. A sense of weary relief began to spread across the nation. The Union was preserved. The fighting was over. President Abraham Lincoln, who had steered the country through its darkest hour, could now turn his full attention to the monumental task of healing and rebuilding what we now call Reconstruction. Lincoln's vision for this post-war era was one of reconciliation, not retribution. He famously spoke of malice toward none, with charity for all, urging the nation to bind up its wounds and achieve a just and lasting peace. He believed in a lenient approach, one that would bring the southern states back into the fold as quickly and painlessly as possible. He wanted to mend the fractured national family. But just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14th, Good Friday, that hope for a gentle reconciliation was shattered. President Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, decided to attend a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. They were looking for a brief moment of distraction, a small celebration of the war's end. During the third act, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box. He knew the play by heart and timed his attack to coincide with a moment of loud laughter from the audience, hoping it would muffle the sound of his single shot therein. Booth aimed the pistol at the back of Lincoln's head and fired. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Booth leaped from the box onto the stage, reportedly shouting Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always two tyrants, the state motto of Virginia. Despite breaking his leg in the fall, he managed to escape into the night, triggering one of the largest manhunts in American history. Back in the presidential box, the scene was one of horror and disbelief. A young army surgeon named Charles Lele was the first doctor to reach the president. He quickly determined the wound was mortal. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, the Peterson House, where he was laid diagonally on a bed that was too short for his tall frame. Throughout the long night, cabinet members, generals, and officials kept a solemn vigil. Doctors could do nothing. Lincoln never regained consciousness. At 7:22 the next morning, on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, died. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing by his bedside, famously whispered, "Now he belongs to the ages." The news of the assassination spread rapidly via telegraph, sending shockwaves across the country and around the world. What should have been a time of celebration turned into a period of profound national grief. In the North, people who had just been celebrating the war's end were now plunged into mourning. Church bells tolled, businesses closed, and people gathered in the streets, weeping openly. The sense of loss was immense. They had lost their leader, the man they called Father Abraham, the savior of the Union. Even in the South, the reaction was not one of universal celebration. While some hardline Confederates rejoiced at the death of the man they saw as a tyrant, many others, including some former Confederate leaders, were filled with a sense of dread. They understood that Lincoln's policy of malice toward none was their best hope for a lenient peace. Withingona, they feared what might come next. They worried, rightly so, that his death would unleash a desire for vengeance from the North. Lincoln's body was returned to the White House, where it lay in state in the East Room. Then began one of the most remarkable funeral processions in history. A train, dubbed the Lincoln Special, carried his coffin on a nearly 1,700-mile journey from Washington, D.C., back to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. The journey retraced, in reverse, the path Lincoln had taken to the Capitol as president-elect in 1861. The funeral train traveled through 7 states and 180 cities over 3 weeks. At each stop, day or night, massive crowds gathered to pay their respects. In major cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, his coffin was taken off the train for public viewings, where hundreds of thousands of people stood in line for hours just to catch a final glimpse of their fallen leader. Millions more lined the railroad tracks, holding candles, singing hymns, or simply standing in silent tribute as the train passed by. It was a shared, national experience of mourning on a scale never seen before. The country was united in its grief. But the impact of Lincoln's death went far beyond personal sorrow. It fundamentally altered the course of American history, particularly the process of Reconstruction. With Lincoln gone, Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner from Tennessee, was sworn in as president. Johnson had been chosen as Lincoln's running mate in 1864 to show national unity, but he did not share Lincoln's political skill, wisdom, or compassionate vision. While Johnson initially spoke of punishing the South, his actual policies were surprisingly lenient toward former Confederate leaders. He issued thousands of pardons, allowing the old Southern elite to quickly regain power in state governments. This approach put him on a direct collision course with a group in Congress known as the Radical Republicans, led by figures like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. The Radicals believed that Lincoln's plan, and especially Johnson's, was far too forgiving. They wanted to fundamentally restructure Southern society, protect the rights of newly freed African Americans, and punish the Confederate leaders who they believed had committed treason. Lincoln, with his immense political capital and gift for persuasion, might have been able to navigate the treacherous waters between these competing visions. He was a master of compromise and finding common ground. He might have been able to guide the nation toward his vision of a just and lasting peace that also secured basic rights for the formerly enslaved. Andrew Johnson, however, lacked this ability. He was stubborn, politically clumsy, and deeply prejudiced. His conflicts with the Radical Republicans escalated into a full-blown political war. He vetoed key legislation aimed at protecting civil rights, including the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Congress, in turn, overrode his vetoes, a rare and powerful move. The political battle became so intense that it led to the impeachment of President Johnson in 1868. While he was acquitted in the Senate by a single vote, his presidency was effectively shattered. Under the control of the Radical Republicans, Congress passed its own plan for Reconstruction, known as Radical or Congressional Reconstruction. This plan was much harsher than anything Lincoln had envisioned. It divided the South into 5 military districts, each governed by a Union general. It required Southern states to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born in the United States, including African Americans. It also disenfranchised many former Confederates while granting voting rights to black men. For a brief period, this led to significant political and social change in the South. African Americans voted, held political office, and established schools and churches, but this period was short-lived. The deep-seated resentment of many white Southerners, combined with a waning commitment from the North, led to the rise of violent opposition groups and a gradual rollback of the progress that had been made. So, how would things have been different if Lincoln had lived? It's one of history's great what-ifs. Would his political genius have forged a more successful and less painful Reconstruction? Could he have better protected the newly won freedoms of African Americans, while also healing the wounds of the nation? We can never know for sure. Some historians argue that even Lincoln would have struggled against the immense challenges of the era. Others believe his leadership would have made all the difference, potentially averting the decades of racial segregation and violence that followed. What is certain is that Lincoln's assassination was a national catastrophe. It not only deprived the country of a beloved leader, but also robbed it of his unique vision for a reconciled and reunified nation. The bullet that struck him down in Ford's Theater didn't just end a life. It changed the future, creating a power vacuum that unleashed the very bitterness and desire for vengeance that Lincoln had worked so hard to contain. The mourning was for the man, but it was also for the lost promise of a more compassionate peace. Thank you for joining us for this chapter. The story of Reconstruction is complex and continues to shape America today. We hope you'll subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll explore the turbulent presidency of Andrew Johnson and the unfolding battle for the nation's soul. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to our series on American history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 7. Andrew Johnson takes the helm. Imagine this. The nation is reeling from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The Civil War has just ended, leaving a trail of devastation and a country deeply divided. Into this chaotic scene steps a man few had expected to hold the highest office: Andrew Johnson. So, who was this man, and how did his presidency shape the crucial years of Reconstruction? Andrew Johnson's story is a classic American tale of rising from humble beginnings. Born into poverty in North Carolina, he never attended a day of school. He was apprenticed as a tailor and, believe it or not, his future wife taught him how to read and write more proficiently. He moved to Tennessee, where his political career took off. He was a fierce advocate for the common man, the small farmers and laborers, and he deeply distrusted the wealthy planter class of the South. This background is absolutely key to understanding his beliefs. Johnson was a Southerner, a Democrat, and a staunch defender of states' rights. Yet, he was also a passionate Unionist who had refused to secede with his home state of Tennessee. When Lincoln chose him as his running mate in 1864, it was a strategic move to show national unity. But here's the twist. While Johnson hated the wealthy secessionist leaders, he held deeply ingrained racist views and did not believe in equality for African Americans. He saw the United States as a white man's government. This fundamental belief would set him on a collision course with many in Washington. When Johnson became president in April 1865, the big question was, how do we rebuild the South and bring it back into the Union? This period, known as Reconstruction, was a blank slate, and Johnson had his own very specific ideas. He called his plan Presidential Reconstruction. He wanted to bring the southern states back into the fold quickly and with as little federal interference as possible. Congress was not in session when he took office, giving him a window of several months to act on his own. So, what did his plan look like? First, Johnson offered a general amnesty to most former Confederates. All they had to do was take an oath of loyalty to the United States. However, he made a significant exception for high-ranking Confederate officials and wealthy planter-zoes, with property worth over $20,000. Remember his disdain for the Southern aristocracy. This was it in action. These individuals had to apply to him personally for a pardon. You can just imagine them, the very people who had led the rebellion, now having to grovel before the president they despised. And Johnson, relishing the power, granted pardons generously. In his mind, he was humbling the elite, not punishing the South as a whole. Under his plan, the southern states could re-establish their governments as soon as they met a few conditions. They had to nullify their acts of abolish slavery by ratifying the 13th Amendment, and repudiate the debts they had incurred during the war. Once they did that, they could hold elections and send representatives back to Congress. It seemed simple enough, a path to swift reunion. Johnson believed he was following Lincoln's lenient vision, but he overlooked a critical component: protecting the rights and futures of the 4 million newly freed African Americans. The consequences of this omission were immediate and devastating. As the old Southern power structure quickly reasserted itself, the new state governments began passing a series of restrictive laws known as the Black Codes. These codes were slavery by another name. They severely limited the freedom of African Americans, dictating where they could work, what kind of jobs they could hold, and whether they could own land. Vagrancy laws were used to force black men into labor contracts, and their children could be taken as apprentices. It was a clear attempt to restore the old social order and create a compliant, cheap labor force. When Congress finally reconvened in December 1865, they were horrified. The men arriving to represent the newly reconstructed Southern states were not repentant Unionists. Instead, many were the very same leaders who had orchestrated the secession, former Confederate generals, colonels, and even the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. To the Northern congressmen, it looked as if the South had lost the war, but was now winning the peace. They felt that the sacrifices of the Union Army were being betrayed. This set the stage for the first major conflicts between President Johnson and Congress. The legislative branch was dominated by Republicans, but they weren't a monolithic group. There were moderate Republicans who initially wanted to work with Johnson, and then there were the radical Republicans, led by figures like Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate. The radicals had a much different vision for Reconstruction. They believed the federal government had a moral obligation to protect the rights of freedmen, crush the power of the old planter class for good, and fundamentally remake Southern society. They saw the Southern states not as misguided siblings, but as conquered provinces that should be treated as such. The first major clash came over to key pieces of legislation. The first was a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau. This was an agency created to help newly freed slaves and poor whites in the South by providing food, housing, education, and medical aid. It was a lifeline for millions. The second was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted citizenship and equal rights to all persons born in the United States, regardless of race. This was a direct challenge to the Black Codes. Both bills passed Congress, but then came the shock. Andrew Johnson vetoed them. He argued that these bills were an unconstitutional expansion of federal power and an infringement on states' rights. He claimed that Congress should be making laws for the Southern states when they were even represented. His veto message for the Civil Rights Act was particularly inflammatory, playing on racist fears and arguing it would discriminate against white people. This was the point of no return. Johnson's vetoes were a declaration of war against the congressional Republicans. For the moderates, it was the final straw. They now realized that the president could not be trusted to protect the freedmen or ensure a just peace. They joined forces with the radicals, creating a powerful, veto-proof majority. In a historic move, Congress overrode Johnson's veto of the Civil Rights Act. It was the first time in American history that a major piece of legislation was passed over a presidential veto. They did the same with the Freedmen's Bureau bill shortly after. The battle lines were drawn. Congress, not the president, was now in control of Reconstruction. This showdown established a new phase of the era, known as Radical Reconstruction, which we'll explore in our next chapter. The conflict between a stubborn, states' rights president and a determined, reform-minded Congress would only escalate from here, leading to one of the most dramatic political confrontations in American history. The impeachment of a president, Andrew Johnson's presidency, which began with the promise of healing a fractured nation, had instead deepened the divisions and set the stage for a bitter struggle over the very meaning of freedom and the future of the American Republic. Thanks for watching. We've just scratched the surface of this incredibly complex period. If you found this interesting, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter on Radical Reconstruction. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to our series on American history. Today, we're diving into a pivotal and incredibly complex period right after the Civil War. The start of presidential Reconstruction. The guns had fallen silent, but the battle for the future of the United States was just beginning. The central question was immense. How do you bring a shattered nation back together? Abraham Lincoln, before his tragic assassination, had already been thinking about this. He favored a lenient approach, often called the 10% plan. His goal was reconciliation, not punishment. He believed that if just 10% of a state's 1860 voters took an oath of allegiance to the Union, that state could form a new government and be He wanted to make it relatively easy for the South to rejoin the fold. hoping to heal the nation's wounds quickly. But then, an assassin's bullet changed everything. Suddenly, Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner from Tennessee, was thrust into the presidency. This was a man who had remained loyal to the Union, but his background and his views were vastly different from Lincoln's. The entire country, North and South, held its breath. What would Johnson do? How would his vision of Reconstruction shape the nation? Initially, many radical Republicans in the North were hopeful. Johnson had a reputation for being tough on the wealthy Southern planter class, the very people they blamed for the war. He famously said, "Treason must be made odious," which led many to believe he would take a hard line against the former Confederacy. They expected him to champion the rights of the newly freed African Americans and punish the leaders of the rebellion. But those hopes would soon be dashed. In the summer of 1865, with Congress in recess, Johnson seized the opportunity to implement his own Reconstruction plan. It was surprisingly similar to Lincoln's in its leniency, but with some crucial differences. Johnson's plan required Southern states to nullify their acts of secession, abolish slavery by ratifying the 13th Amendment, and repudiate their war debts. On the surface, these seemed like reasonable demands. The real issue, however, lay in who would be in charge of this process. Johnson began issuing pardons, and he did so on a massive scale. He granted amnesty to thousands upon thousands of former Confederates. While he initially excluded high-ranking Confederate officials and wealthy planters, those with property worth over $20,000, he created a loophole. These excluded individuals could apply directly to him for a personal pardon, and apply. They did. Throughout 1865, a steady stream of former Confederate leaders traveled to Washington, and Johnson, surprisingly, pardoned the vast majority of them. Why did he do this? Johnson was a firm believer in states' rights and held deeply ingrained white supremacist views. He believed that the federal government had no right to dictate voting requirements to the states. In his mind, this was a white man's government, and he had no intention of pushing for black suffrage or social equality. His goal was to restore the Union as quickly as possible. With the old Southern power structure menace, the institution of slavery largely intact, he wanted to empower the poor and middle-class whites of the South, but he ended up pardoning the very planter elite he had once condemned. The result of these policies was immediate and shocking to many in the North. Under Johnson's lenient terms, the Southern states quickly organized new governments in late 1865. And who did they elect to represent them? In many cases, they elected the very same men who had led them out of the Union just a few years earlier. Former Confederate generals, colonels, and even the Vice President of the Confederacy. Alexander Stephens were elected to Congress. Imagine being a Union soldier who had just spent 4 years fighting a brutal war, perhaps losing friends and family members. You come home, and you hear that the same leaders who orchestrated the rebellion are now heading back to Washington to make laws for the country they tried to destroy. The sense of betrayal and outrage in the North was palpable. It felt as if the South hadn't learned its lesson at all. It looked like they were trying to win through politics what they had lost on the battlefield. The alarm in the North grew even louder with the passage of the Black Codes in the South. These were a series of restrictive laws passed by the new Southern state legislatures. While they granted African Americans certain limited rights like the right to marry or own property there, primary purpose was to control the labor and behavior of the newly freed people. The Black Codes essentially tried to recreate the conditions of slavery. For example, they often required black people to sign yearly labor contracts. If they quit before the year was up, they could be arrested and forced to forfeit their wages. Some codes barred them from renting land or borrowing money to buy it. Vagrancy laws made it a crime for a black person to be unemployed, and the punishment was often forced labor on a plantation. They were forbidden from serving on juries, testifying against whites, or carrying weapons. In Mississippi, one of the harshest codes declared that all freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes must have lawful employment by the second Monday in January 1866. It was a thinly veiled attempt to force them back onto the plantations. When the members of the 39th Congress gathered in Washington in December 1865, they were horrified. They looked at the situation and saw a South that was unrepentant and defiant. They saw former rebels being pardoned and elected to high office. They saw the Black Codes stripping away the very freedom that the Union had just fought a war to secure. For the Republicans in Congress, this was completely unacceptable. The sacrifices of the war seemed to be in vain. This is where the major conflict begins. Congress refused to seat the newly elected Southern representatives. They saw Johnson's plan as a failure that betrayed the Union's cause. A powerful faction, the Radical Republicans, led by figures like Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, believed that Reconstruction needed to be much more thorough. They argued that the federal government had a moral obligation to protect the rights of freedmen, including the right to vote. They wanted to fundamentally restructure Southern society, break the power of the planter class, and ensure that the ideals of liberty and equality applied to all Americans. The stage was now set for an epic political showdown. On one side was President Andrew Johnson, who believed his job was done and that the states should be left to govern themselves. On the other side was a determined and increasingly unified Republican Congress, who believed that presidential Reconstruction was a disaster and that Congress must take control to finish the work of the war. This clash between the president and Congress would define the next phase of Reconstruction, leading to landmark legislation, the first ever presidential impeachment, and a struggle over the very meaning of freedom and citizenship in America. Johnson's attempt at a quick and lenient restoration had failed to secure a lasting peace and had instead ignited a new political war. Thanks for watching. We'll explore how Congress fought back against Johnson and launched its own plan for Reconstruction in our next video. If you found this interesting, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss it. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on the Reconstruction era. Today, we're diving into a crucial and often overlooked part of American history. Chapter 9, the Black Codes. What were they, and how did they shape the years immediately following the Civil War? Let's get into it. The year is 1865. The Civil War has just ended, and the 13th Amendment has abolished slavery for the nearly 4 million formerly enslaved African Americans. This moment should have been the dawn of a new age of freedom. However, the reality on the ground, especially in the South, was far more complicated. Almost immediately, Southern state legislatures, controlled by white former Confederates, began passing a series of restrictive laws known as the Black Codes. So, what exactly were these codes? Think of them as a new legal framework designed to control the labor and behavior of newly freed black people. While the North had won the war, the Southern elite were determined to preserve their pre-war social and economic order as much as possible. The Black Codes were their primary tool for achieving this. On the surface, these laws granted certain rights to African Americans, such as the right to own property, marry, and make contracts. But these rights came with a mountain of restrictions that essentially aimed to recreate the conditions of slavery. Let's break down some of the most common provisions found in these codes. First, let's talk about labor. The Southern economy was built on agriculture, and white landowners desperately needed a cheap, controllable labor force to work their fields. The Black Codes forced black workers into year-long labor contracts. If a worker quit before the end of their contract, they could be arrested and forced to forfeit their wages. In some states, like Mississippi, the law declared that any black person who didn't have a written contract proving they were employed could be arrested for vagrancy. This brings us to the vagrancy laws. These were some of the most powerful and insidious parts of the Black Codes. These laws made it a crime to be unemployed. A black person arrested for vagrancy could be fined heavily. If they couldn't pay the fine, which most couldn't, they would be hired out to a white landowner who would pay the fine for them. In return, the individual had to work for that landowner for a set period, often for little to no pay. This system, known as convict leasing, was essentially a legal loophole that recreated a form of forced labor. It trapped countless black men, women, and even children in a cycle of debt and servitude that was nearly impossible to escape. The Black Codes also severely restricted movement. Black people were often forbidden from traveling without a pass from their employer. Curfews were established, requiring them to be off the streets after a certain hour. In some towns, they were not allowed to enter the city limits at all without permission. This was a direct attempt to control where black people could live and work, preventing them from seeking better opportunities or organizing for their rights. Imagine being told you are free, but you can't leave your former plantation without your old master's permission. That was the reality for many. Next, let's look at the restrictions on rights and freedoms. The Black Codes barred African Americans from testifying against white people in court. This meant that if a white person committed a crime against a black person, it was almost impossible to get a conviction. They were also forbidden from serving on juries, effectively shutting them out of the justice system. The right to bear arms a fundamental right for white citizens, was denied to black people. In many areas, they were prohibited from renting or leasing land in rural areas, forcing them back onto plantations as sharecroppers or laborers. Sharecropping is another key concept to understand. Under this system, a landowner would allow a tenant of farm, a formerly enslaved familia, use their land in exchange for a share of the crop produced. While it sounded like a step up from slavery, the system was designed to keep the tenants in perpetual debt. Landowners would charge exorbitant prices for tools, seeds, and food, which the sharecroppers had to buy on credit. At the end of the year, after the landowner took their share of the crop and deducted the debts, the sharecropper was often left with nothing, or even owed more than they started with. This debt peonage ensured a stable, dependent workforce for the plantation owners. So, how did all of this challenge the very meaning of emancipation? The promise of the 13th Amendment was freedom. But what did freedom mean if you couldn't choose your employer, if you couldn't travel freely, if you couldn't seek justice in a court of law, or if you couldn't own a weapon to defend yourself and your family? The Black Codes demonstrated a deep-seated refusal by the white South to accept black citizenship and equality. They were a clear message that while the institution of slavery was officially dead, the underlying ideology of white supremacy was very much alive and well. These laws were not a secret. They were passed openly by state governments. And the North took notice. The blatant attempt to subvert the results of the Civil War outraged many Republicans in Congress. They saw the Black Codes as an act of defiance and a betrayal of the Union's victory. This outrage was a major catalyst for the next phase of Reconstruction, known as Radical Reconstruction. The actions of the Southern states convinced Congress that President Andrew Johnson's lenient approach to Reconstruction was failing. They concluded that more direct, federal intervention was necessary to protect the rights of freedmen and truly reconstruct the South. In response to the Black Codes, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and, later, the 14th Amendment. The Civil Rights Act declared that all persons born in the United States were citizens, without regard to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It was a direct counterattack on the Black Codes, aiming to grant African Americans the full rights of citizenship. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, went even further by writing these principles into the Constitution itself. It guaranteed equal protection of the laws to all citizens, providing a constitutional basis for challenging discriminatory state laws. The federal government also passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which placed the South under military rule and required the former Confederate states to draft new constitutions that guaranteed voting rights to black men. For a brief period, these federal actions were successful in overturning the Black Codes. With federal troops providing protection, black men were able to vote, hold political office, and establish schools and churches. This was a revolutionary moment of black political power in the South. However, it's crucial to understand that the spirit of the Black Codes did not simply disappear. While the laws themselves were nullified by federal action, the system of control they represented morphed into new forms. Once Reconstruction ended in 1877 and federal troops were withdrawn from the South, white supremacist governments, often called redeemers, regained power. They quickly began implementing new laws and practices to disenfranchise and segregate African Americans. This new system of racial oppression became known as the Jim Crow era. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were used to strip black men of their right to vote. Segregation laws mandated separate public facilities for black and white citizens, from schools and hospitals to water fountains and cemeteries. And all of this was backed by the constant threat of violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan. In many ways, the Jim Crow laws were simply the Black Codes reinvented for a new era. They were a continuation of the same effort to maintain a racial hierarchy and control black life in the South. So, when we study the Black Codes, we're not just looking at a brief, failed experiment from 1865 and 1866. We are looking at the blueprint for a century of racial oppression in America. They represent the immediate, powerful, and organized resistance to black freedom and equality that emerged right after the Civil War. They revealed the deep conflict over the meaning of freedom itself. Was freedom simply the absence of slavery, or was it the full possession of civil and political rights? The battle over that question, which began with the Black Codes, would define much of American history for the next 100 years, and continues to resonate in our society today. Understanding the Black Codes is essential to understanding why Reconstruction was so difficult, and why the fight for civil rights was such a long and arduous struggle. They show us that emancipation was not an event, but a process that was fiercely contested every step of the way. Thanks for watching. I hope this look at the Black Codes has given you a deeper understanding of this critical period in history. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more chapters from our nation as past. And as always, let me know your thoughts and questions in the comments below. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the American Civil War and its aftermath. Today, we are re-diving deep into a fascinating and often overlooked chapter of American history: the intense political battle that followed the war. This is the story of how Congress pushed back against the president, fundamentally reshaping the course of Reconstruction. So, grab your notebooks, get comfortable, and let's explore Chapter 10. Congress pushes back. Now, picture this. The Civil War has just ended. The cannons have fallen silent, and the nation is grappling with immense questions. How do we rebuild the South? What is the status of the nearly 4 million newly freed African Americans? And who gets to decide all of this? President Andrew Johnson, who took office after Lincoln's assassination, had his own ideas. He favored a lenient approach, what's often called presidential reconstruction. His plan aimed to quickly restore the southern states to the Union with minimal fuss. He pardoned many former Confederates, and under his watch, southern states began passing restrictive laws known as Black Codes, which were essentially a new form of social control over African Americans, severely limiting their freedom and economic opportunities. But not everyone in Washington was on board with this let's forgive and forget approach. In the halls of Congress, a powerful and vocal group was watching these developments with growing alarm. They were known as the Radical Republicans, and trust me, they earned the name Radical. Led by figures like Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives and Charles Sumner in the Senate, these weren't your average politicians. They were driven by a powerful mix of moral conviction and political strategy. They believed that the Confederacy had committed treason and that the leaders of the rebellion should be punished, not pardoned. More importantly, they were fiercely committed to the idea of civil rights and protections for the freedmen. They saw the Black Codes for what they were: an attempt to recreate the conditions of slavery under a different name. They believed that simply ending slavery wasn't enough. The federal government had a moral obligation to ensure that African Americans were not just free, but also had the rights of full citizens. This set the stage for an epic political showdown. The Radical Republicans argued that Johnson's plan was a betrayal of the Unionist victory and a slap in the face to the soldiers who had fought and died for freedom. They saw it as handing control of the South right back to the very same people who had just tried to destroy the country. They felt that if the old Southern elite were allowed back into power successfully, they would simply re-establish a system of racial hierarchy and oppression. The Radicals weren't just a fringe group. Their influence was growing rapidly. Many moderate Republicans, who might have initially supported a quicker reconciliation, were horrified by the violence against freedmen in the South and the arrogance of the former Confederates, who were being elected to Congress as if nothing had happened. The reports coming out of the South were grim, detailing attacks, intimidation, and a systematic effort to deny African Americans their basic rights. This pushed many moderates into the radical camp, creating a powerful coalition in Congress that was ready to take on the president. Their first major move was to refuse to seat the newly elected congressmen from the southern states in December 1865. Imagine the drama. These men, some of them former Confederate generals and officials, arrive in Washington ready to take their seats, only to be told, not so fast. Congress essentially declared that the president did not have the sole authority to determine the process of Reconstruction. They formed a joint committee on Reconstruction to investigate conditions in the South and to propose their own requirements for readmission. This was a direct challenge to presidential authority. The struggle for control was on. Congress was asserting its power, arguing that it, not the executive branch, had the constitutional authority to oversee the rebuilding of the nation. This wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was a fundamental clash over the separation of powers and the future direction of the country. The Radical Republicans didn't just block the president's plan. They started to build their own. They called for much stronger federal protections for African Americans. Their vision of Reconstruction was far more, well, radical. They wanted to ensure voting rights for black men, secure their access to education and land, and used the power of the federal government to crush the remnants of the old Confederate power structure. Their first major legislative victory came in 1866. They passed the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which expanded the powers of an agency created to help newly freed slaves transition to freedom. The Bureau provided food, housing, medical aid, established schools, and offered legal assistance. It was an unprecedented federal effort to provide social welfare. They also passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which declared that all persons born in the United States were now citizens, with full and equal benefit of all laws. This was a direct counterattack against the black codes. But President Johnson was not going to back down. In a move that shocked many, he vetoed both bills. He argued that they were an unconstitutional expansion of federal power and that they discriminated against the white citizens of the South. His veto messages were fiery, and he publicly attacked the radical Republican leaders, calling them traitors. But this was a massive political miscalculation. Johnson's vetoes completely alienated the moderate Republicans and united Congress against him. The radicals had the votes. In a historic move, Congress overrode Johnson's vetoes for both the Freedmen's Bureau Bill and the Civil Rights Act. This was the first time in American history that Congress had overridden a presidential veto on a major piece of legislation. The message was clear. Congress, not the president, was now in the driver's seat of Reconstruction. But the radicals knew that laws and even veto overrides could be undone by future presidents or Supreme Court decisions. They wanted something more permanent. They wanted to write their principles into the very fabric of the nation's founding document. This led to the creation of one of the most important amendments in U.S. history, the 14th Amendment. This amendment is a cornerstone of American law to this day. It did several things. First, it constitutionalized the principle of birthright citizenship, stating that anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen. This directly overturned the infamous Dred Scott decision from 1857. Second, it prohibited states from abridging the privileges or immunities of citizens or depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And crucially, it guaranteed every person the equal protection of the laws. It also barred many former Confederate leaders from holding office and gave Congress the power to enforce the amendment through legislation. This amendment was a radical Republican smash. They made its ratification a condition for the Southern states to be readmitted to the Union. President Johnson, predictably, opposed it and encouraged the Southern states to reject it, which all of them except Tennessee promptly did. This defiance from the South and the president only strengthened the radicals' resolve. The 1866 midterm elections became a national referendum on Reconstruction. Johnson went on a disastrous speaking tour, the swing around the circle, where his angry, rambling speeches alienated voters. The result was a landslide victory for the Republicans, giving them a veto-proof supermajority in both houses of Congress. The people had spoken, and they had sided with Congress. With this powerful new mandate, Congress launched what is now known as Radical Reconstruction or Congressional Reconstruction in 1867. They passed the Reconstruction Acts, which swept away the state governments Johnson had approved. The acts divided the 10 unreconstructed southern states into 5 military districts, each governed by a Union general. To be readmitted to the Union, these states had to draft new constitutions that guaranteed voting rights for all men, regardless of race, and they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. This was a revolutionary step. For the first time in American history, African American men in the South were given the right to vote and participate in the political process. They served as delegates to state constitutional conventions, were elected to state legislatures, and even to the U.S. Congress. The struggle for control had reached its peak. The clash between Congress and the president became so intense that it culminated in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868. While he was ultimately acquitted in the Senate by a single vote, the impeachment trial demonstrated the sheer power that the radical Republicans wielded and how determined they were to see their vision of Reconstruction through. This period of congressional pushback fundamentally altered the relationship between the branches of government and set a new, albeit temporary, course for the nation. It was a time of incredible idealism, fierce political battles, and a genuine, if short, effort to create a more equitable American republic. The laws and amendments passed during this era laid the legal groundwork for future civil rights movements a century later. So, that's the story of how Congress, led by the radical Republicans, pushed back against the president and seized control of Reconstruction. It's a complex and dramatic tale of political will, moral conviction, and a fight for the very soul of the nation. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series on American history. Today, we're diving into a crucial, yet often overlooked, chapter. The story of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Civil War was over, the Union was preserved, and nearly 4 million enslaved people were now free. But what did that freedom actually mean? Imagine being set free with nothing but the clothes on your back. No money, no property, and in a society that was still deeply hostile. This was the reality for millions. How do you start a new life from scratch? That's the question the nation had to answer. And its first major attempt was an unprecedented experiment called the Freedmen's Bureau. So, what exactly was this bureau, officially known as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands? It was established by Congress in March 1865, just a month before the war ended. Think of it as the first ever large-scale federal social welfare agency in American history. Its mission was enormous: to manage the transition from slavery to freedom. This wasn't just about handing out aid. It was about building the foundations of a new society in the war-torn South. The Bureau was tasked with providing food, housing, and medical aid, establishing schools, offering legal assistance, and attempting to settle formerly enslaved people on land confiscated or abandoned during the war. It was a monumental undertaking, led by General Olivero Howard, a man genuinely committed to the cause. The Bureau's agents, many of whom were former Union Army officers, fanned out across the South. They were supposed to act as protectors, mediators, and providers for the newly freed population. In many areas, the sight of a bureau agent was the first tangible sign that the federal government was on their side. One of their most immediate tasks was distributing food. The war had devastated the Southern economy, leaving both black and white residents on the brink of starvation. The Bureau issued millions of food rations, preventing widespread famine in the chaotic months following the war's end. It was an emergency response that saved countless lives and provided a basic level of stability when there was none. Beyond immediate survival, the Bureau's most profound and lasting impact was in the field of education. Before the war, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. As a result, literacy was a powerful symbol of freedom. African Americans were hungry for education, believing it was the key to true liberation and opportunity. They organized their own schools and churches in makeshift buildings, and the Freedmen's Bureau stepped in to provide crucial support. The Bureau spent over $5 million, a huge sum at the time, to set up schools. It helped build schoolhouses, paid teachers, and provided books. It worked alongside Northern aid societies and black communities to create thousands of schools, from elementary schools to colleges and universities. Institutions like Howard University, named after the Bureau's commissioner, Fisk University, and Hampton University, all trace their origins to this period. And the Bureau's efforts, for the first time, an entire generation of Southern black children had the chance to learn, a dream their parents could have only whispered about. The Bureau also stepped into the legal arena, creating a system of special courts to protect the rights of freed people. In a society where the traditional legal system was stacked against them, these courts were a lifeline. They heard cases on everything from labor disputes to family matters. Imagine you're a freedman who worked for a planter all year, and at the end, he refuses to pay you. Before the Bureau, you had no recourse. Now, you could take your case to a Bureau agent who could compel the planter to pay fair wages. The Bureau helped legalize marriages that had been unrecognized under slavery, reuniting families torn apart by sale. It supervised labor contracts, trying to ensure that they were fair and not just a new form of slavery. While the system was far from perfect, it represented a radical idea that black Americans were citizens entitled to equal justice under the law. Another key part of the Bureau's mission was land. This was perhaps the most hopeful and ultimately the most heartbreaking part of the story. Many formerly enslaved people believed they had a right to the land they had worked for generations without pay. The idea of 40 acres and a mule became a powerful symbol of this hope. This phrase came from General Sherman's Special Field Order, No. 15, which had set aside a huge tract of coastal land in South Carolina and Georgia for settlement by freed families. The Freedmen's Bureau was initially supposed to administer this land, along with other abandoned plantations. For a brief moment, It seemed like a true economic revolution was possible. Land ownership meant economic independence. It meant you could provide for your family, build a community, and escape the control of your former masters. However, this dream was quickly shattered. In the fall of 1865, President Andrew Johnson, who had taken office after Lincoln's assassination, began pardoning former Confederates. His policy of presidential Reconstruction was lenient, and one of its key components was returning all confiscated property to its original white owners. This was a devastating blow. Bureau agents were ordered to evict the very families they had just settled on the land. You can imagine the betrayal and despair. A Bureau agent in South Carolina described the scene as painful, as he had to tell freed people that the land they thought was theirs was being given back to their former enslavers. This failure to provide a meaningful economic base through land redistribution would have long-lasting consequences, locking many African Americans into a cycle of poverty and dependence through systems like So, why did the Freedmen's Bureau, with all its promise, ultimately have such a limited impact? First, it was always meant to be temporary. Congress only chartered it for a few years at a time. Second, it was severely underfunded and understaffed. At its peak, there were only about 900 agents spread across the entire South. One agent might be responsible for a huge county with tens of thousands of people. They were simply overwhelmed. Third, they faced intense and often violent opposition from white Southerners. Many former Confederates saw the Bureau as an illegitimate tool of Northern aggression, a carpetbagger government interfering in their affairs. Bureau agents were threatened, attacked, and sometimes killed. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups targeted not just the freed people, but also the schools and churches the Bureau helped to build. Furthermore, the political will in the North began to fade. The Bureau was constantly under attack in Washington. President Johnson, a Southerner himself, was hostile to the Bureau and vetoed a bill to extend its life in 1866. Although Congress overrode his veto, the writing was on the wall. Many Northern politicians grew tired of the ongoing Southern problem and wanted to move on. They were more interested in economic reconciliation with the white South than in securing justice for the black South. By 1872, just 7 years after it was created, the Freedmen's Bureau was officially dismantled. Its end marked a turning point, signaling the federal government's retreat from protecting the civil rights of African Americans. In the end, the legacy of the Freedmen's Bureau is complex. It was a flawed and short-lived experiment, and its failure to secure land for freed people was a tragic missed opportunity. However, we can't dismiss its importance. For a brief, critical period, it was a beacon of hope. It provided essential aid that saved lives. It championed the revolutionary cause of education, and it introduced the principle of equal justice. Even if it couldn't fully enforce it, the schools it helped establish became the bedrock of black communities for generations. The experience of engaging with the Bureau taught countless African Americans how to navigate the political system and advocate for their rights. The Freedmen's Bureau was the federal government's first real step, however faltering, toward grappling with its responsibility to its newest citizens. It laid a foundation, and its story serves as a powerful reminder of both the incredible promise of Reconstruction and the painful, enduring challenges of the fight for freedom and equality in America. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know your thoughts on the Freedmen's Bureau in the comments below. See you in the next video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into American history. Today, we're tackling one of the most significant, most powerful, and honestly, most revolutionary amendments in the entire U.S. Constitution. The 14th Amendment. This isn't just another old piece of legislation. It fundamentally reshaped the very definition of what it means to be an American citizen. So, grab a coffee, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Before the 14th Amendment, the question of citizenship was murky, to say the least. The infamous 1857 Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court had declared that people of African descent, whether enslaved or free, were not and could never be citizens of the United States. This was a massive barrier to true freedom and equality, even after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery in 1865. Think about it. If you are not a citizen, you don't have the rights and protections that come with citizenship. You're essentially an outsider in your own home. So, in the aftermath of the Civil War, Congress understood that simply ending slavery wasn't enough. They had to define who was a citizen and ensure their rights were protected. This brings us to Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. It starts with a sentence that changed everything. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Let's break that down. All persons born or naturalized. This established the principle of birthright citizenship. If you're born on U.S. soil, you are a citizen. Period. It didn't matter what your parents' status was, what their race was, or where they came from. This single clause overturned the Dred Scott decision and granted citizenship to the millions of formerly enslaved people, making them full members of the American political community for the first time. It was a radical, revolutionary idea that connected citizenship directly to the land itself, not to bloodlines or heritage. But the amendment didn't stop there. The next part of Section 1 is just as critical. It says no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Wow. Let that sink in. This is the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. Before this, the Bill of Rights was generally understood to only protect citizens from the federal government, but the 14th Amendment explicitly says, no state shall. This meant that, for the first time, the Constitution put federal limits on what state governments could do to their own people. States could no longer pass laws that discriminated against certain groups of citizens or denied them basic fairness and legal rights. The equal protection of the law's phrase is one of the most debated and litigated phrases in American law. Its goal was to prevent the states, especially the former Confederate states, from passing discriminatory laws known as black codes. These codes were designed to restrict the freedom of African Americans, forcing them into labor contracts, denying them the right to vote, to serve on juries, or to testify against white people. The Equal Protection Clause was meant to make these kinds of laws unconstitutional. It was a promise that the law would be applied equally to everyone, regardless of race. So why was this so revolutionary? Because it fundamentally altered the balance of power between the federal government and the states. It gave the federal government the authority and the responsibility to step in and protect the rights of individuals. When states failed to do so, it was a massive expansion of federal power aimed at securing individual liberty. The amendment wasn't just about abstract principles. It was a direct response to the brutal realities of the post-Civil War South. It was an attempt to make the promises of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness a reality for all Americans, not just a select few. It introduced the idea of equality into the Constitution in a direct and powerful way. Now, as you can imagine, an amendment this transformative was not going to be accepted easily, especially in the South. The road to ratification was a fierce political battle. The former Confederate states, which had just been defeated in the Civil War, were not exactly thrilled about the idea of granting full citizenship and equal rights to the very people they had enslaved for generations. To be readmitted into the Union, President Andrew Johnson had initially set very lenient terms for the Southern states. They just had to repudiate secession and ratify the 13th Amendment. Most of them did this, but then they immediately turned around and passed those discriminatory black codes we talked about. This showed Congress that more drastic measures were needed. The Southern states were essentially trying to recreate a system as close to slavery as possible. So, the radical Republicans in Congress took control of Reconstruction. They passed the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which placed the South under military rule and laid out new, stricter conditions for readmission. And the key condition: ratifying the 14th Amendment. This was non-negotiable. The resistance was intense. Southern legislatures, still dominated by former Confederates, initially rejected the amendment outright. They saw it as a violation of states' rights, an attempt by the North to punish them and force a radical social reordering upon them. There were riots, violence, and widespread intimidation aimed at African Americans and their white allies who supported the amendment. Opponents argued it was an unconstitutional power grab by the federal government and that it would lead to the downfall of society as they knew it. But Congress held firm. They refused to seat representatives from any Southern state that had not ratified the amendment. Under the pressure of military occupation and the requirement to be readmitted to the Union and regain self-government, the Southern states, one by one, began to comply. New state governments were formed, often with African American delegates participating for the first time, and they voted to ratify the amendment. It was a long and bitter struggle. The amendment was finally certified as ratified on July 28, 1868, more than 2 years after it was first proposed by Congress. Its ratification wasn't just a legal process. It was a continuation of the Civil War's fight over the soul of America, fought in legislative halls instead of on battlefields. The 14th Amendment was a monumental step forward, a second founding of the United States, if you will. It laid the constitutional foundation for the civil rights movement a century later. Landmark cases like Brown v. Board of Education, which desegregated schools, and Levin v. Virginia, which struck down laws against interracial marriage, were all based on the promise of the Equal Protection Clause. However, the promise of the 14th Amendment was not immediately fulfilled. For nearly 100 years after its ratification, through the era of Jim Crow's segregation and systemic discrimination, its power was often ignored or narrowly interpreted by the courts. The struggle to make its words a reality has been a central theme of American history ever since. So, when we look at the 14th Amendment, we see more than just legal text. We see a declaration of national identity, a promise of equality, and a testament to the fact that our understanding of freedom can evolve and expand. It remains one of the most important tools we have in the ongoing fight for civil rights and justice for all. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore this crucial chapter of American history. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up. And do you forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time. Welcome back to our series on American history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 13, Military Reconstruction, a period that reshaped the American South after the devastation of the Civil War. The war was over, the Confederacy defeated, but the peace was fragile, almost non-existent. The big question was, how do you bring a shattered nation back together? President Andrew Johnson's initial, more lenient approach had failed. It allowed former Confederate leaders to regain power and pass restrictive black codes that were essentially slavery by another name. This outraged the radical Republicans in Congress, who believed a much stronger hand was needed to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans and truly reconstruct the South. So, in 1867, Congress took control. They passed the Reconstruction Acts, effectively wiping the slate clean and starting over. This wasn't about handshakes and forgiveness anymore. This was about force. This was the beginning of military reconstruction. The centerpiece of this new policy was the division of the former Confederacy, excluding Tennessee, which had already been readmitted, into 5 military districts. Imagine looking at a map of the South, not with state lines as we know them, but with new boundaries drawn by military authority. Virginia became Military District Number 1. North and South Carolina were grouped into Number 2. Georgia, Alabama, and Florida formed the 3rd district. Mississippi and Arkansas were combined into the 4th. And finally, Texas and Louisiana made up the 5th. Each district was placed under the command of a Union general, a military governor with immense power. These weren't just figureheads. They were the law. Their job was to oversee every aspect of the transition, from voter registration to the creation of new state governments. The old civil authorities, many of them ex-Confederates, were either stripped of their power or made subordinate to the military. This was a radical, unprecedented move in American history. The federal government using its army to govern its own states. For the white South, it felt like a hostile occupation. For the newly freed slaves, it was a beacon of hope, a promise that their newfound freedom would be protected by the full might of the United States Army. So, what did these military governors and their troops actually do? Their primary mission was to enforce the new laws passed by Congress, especially the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection to all persons born in the United States, and later the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race. Federal troops were stationed in cities and towns across the South. Their presence was a constant, visible reminder of who was in charge. They protected African Americans who were trying to exercise their new rights, often in the face of intense hostility and violence. They supervised voter registration, making sure that black men could register to vote, while many former Confederates were temporarily disenfranchised. Think about how revolutionary this was. Men who had been enslaved just a few years earlier were now lining up to vote, often guarded by the same soldiers who had fought to free them. These troops also oversaw the constitutional conventions where new state constitutions were written. These new constitutions had to be approved by Congress and had to grant universal male suffrage before a state could be readmitted to the Union. Federal soldiers were there to ensure the process was followed, to prevent intimidation, and to maintain order. They were the muscle behind the political transformation of the South. This period created a tense and uneasy peace. On one hand, you had federal troops working to build a new, more equitable society. On the other hand, you had a large portion of the white Southern population who saw this as an illegitimate, tyrannical occupation. They deeply resented the presence of Union soldiers and the empowerment of African Americans. This resentment gave rise to secret societies and violent paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Their goal was to terrorize black citizens and their white allies, to scare them away from voting, holding office, or even owning land. They used night raids, beatings, and murder to try and restore the old social order. Federal troops were often the only thing standing between these terrorists and their victims. Soldiers would patrol against the Klan, guard polling places, and arrest perpetrators of racial violence. It was essentially a low-intensity guerrilla war being fought across the South. The peace was not a true peace. It was a peace maintained by the bayonet. It was a constant struggle, a daily confrontation between the forces of Reconstruction and the forces of violent resistance. The results of military Reconstruction were, to put it mildly, mixed. On the positive side, it led to the readmission of all former Confederate states by 1870. For the first time, African American men could vote and hold political office in large numbers. During this era, hundreds of black men were elected to state legislatures, and several were even elected to the U.S. Congress, like Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce from Mississippi. This was a monumental achievement and a direct result of the federal protection offered during military Reconstruction. New state constitutions were written that were often more progressive than their predecessors, establishing public school systems for the first time in many southern states, benefiting both black and white children. These were real, tangible gains that would have been impossible without the intervention of the federal military. However, these gains were fragile and fiercely contested. The military presence was expensive and became increasingly unpopular in the North. Many Northerners grew tired of the endless conflict in the South and wanted to move on. They suffered from what became known as Reconstruction fatigue. As the 1870s progressed, the federal government's commitment to enforcing Reconstruction began to wane. Political will in Washington was fading. A series of Supreme Court decisions started to chip away at the protections of the 14th and 15th Amendments, making it harder for the federal government to prosecute racial violence. The economic panic of 1873 shifted the nation's focus from civil rights to economic recovery. The final nail in the coffin was the disputed presidential election of 1876. To resolve the crisis, a backroom deal was struck, known as the Compromise of 1877. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was given the presidency, and in return, he agreed to withdraw the last federal troops from the South. With the army gone, the military districts were dissolved, and the period of military Reconstruction came to an abrupt end. The peace that had been maintained by force immediately collapsed. Without federal protection, the newly empowered Southern Democratic governments, often called Redeemers, quickly moved to dismantle the gains of Reconstruction. They implemented poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses to disenfranchise black voters. They passed Jim Crow laws to enforce strict racial segregation. The hope of a biracial democracy in the South was crushed, and it would be nearly a century before the civil rights movement would fight to reclaim those lost rights. In conclusion, military Reconstruction was a bold and controversial experiment. It was an attempt to use the power of the federal military to enforce a radical vision of racial equality and remake Southern society. It achieved some incredible short-term successes, empowering African Americans politically in ways that had been unimaginable just years before. It demonstrated that, with federal will and protection, a more just society was possible. However, it also showed the limits of that power. Military force could maintain order and protect rights for a time, but it couldn't change the hearts and minds of a resentful and resistant population overnight. The eventual withdrawal of troops and the collapse of Reconstruction serve as a powerful and cautionary lesson in American history. It highlights the immense difficulty of achieving lasting social change and the constant vigilance required to protect civil rights. The legacy of this period is complex, a story of both remarkable progress and tragic failure, and its echoes can still be heard in the ongoing struggles for racial justice in America today. Thanks for watching. If you found this chapter of history interesting, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next episode. See you next time. Hey everyone, welcome back to our history series. Today, we re-dive into a truly transformative chapter, the rise of black political participation in the United States after the Civil War. This period, known as Reconstruction, saw some of the most dramatic and important changes in American political history, and it's a story that absolutely needs to be told. Before the Civil War, the idea of black citizens, especially formerly enslaved people, holding political office was almost unthinkable. The vast majority were denied the most basic rights of citizenship, including the right to vote. But the Union victory and the constitutional amendments that followed shattered that old reality. The key turning point was the passage of the Reconstruction Acts of 1867. These landmark laws, passed by a Republican-controlled Congress, essentially rebooted the governments in the former Confederate states. A crucial part of this was the requirement that new state constitutions had to grant voting rights to all adult men, regardless of their race. This single act enfranchised hundreds of thousands of African-American men across the South for the very first time. Imagine the atmosphere. For generations, politics was something done to black communities, not wheat them. Suddenly, they had a voice. They could vote. They could choose their leaders. This was revolutionary. They didn't just participate. They embraced this newfound power with incredible enthusiasm and sophistication. African Americans flocked to register to vote. They organized political meetings, often in churches, which had long been the cornerstone of black community life. They formed union leagues and other political groups to educate themselves on the issues, discuss candidates, and mobilize voters. They understood that the ballot was not just a piece of paper. It was a shield to protect their freedom, a tool to build a better future for their families, and a declaration of their equal standing as American citizens. This wave of new voters completely reshaped the political landscape of the South, and it led to another historic first: the election of black men to public office. Think about that. Men who, just a few years earlier, were legally considered property, were now walking the halls of state legislatures and even the U.S. Congress. Let's start at the federal level. In 1870, Hiram Rhodes, Revels of Mississippi, made history. He was elected by the state legislature to fill a vacant seat in the United States Senate. In a moment rich with irony, the seat he took had once been held by Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. Revels was a minister and a college administrator, known for his intellect and moderate approach. His election was a powerful symbol to the entire nation that a new order had arrived. Soon after, another Mississippian, Blanche K. Bruce, was elected to the Senate. Bruce, who had been born into slavery, became the first African American to serve a full 6-year term. He was a skilled politician who championed the rights, not just of black Americans, but also of Native Americans and Chinese immigrants. Together, Revels and Bruce broke a monumental barrier. But the real groundswell of black political power was happening at the state and local levels. During Reconstruction, roughly 2,000 African-American men held public office across the South. About 600 of them were elected to state legislatures. In South Carolina, black legislators actually constituted a majority in the lower house of the state assembly for a time. This was unprecedented. These new lawmakers weren't just placeholders. They were active, engaged, and effective. They brought their unique life experiences as former slaves, as soldiers, as ministers, as farmers into the political arena. They had a clear vision for what a more just and equitable South should look like. So, what did they accomplish? A lot. One of their most significant and lasting achievements was the establishment of public education systems in the South. Before the war, there was no widespread state-funded public schooling in the region, especially not for black children. These new, racially integrated governments wrote it into their state constitutions. They championed laws that created schools for all children, black and white. This was a radical idea at the time, and it laid the foundation for public education as we know it today in the southern states. They also worked to pass laws that protected the civil rights of all citizens. They pushed for anti-discrimination measures in public accommodations and transportation. They worked to reform the justice system, seeking to make it more fair and less biased. They also focused on economic issues, advocating for fair labor contracts for sharecroppers, and trying to make land ownership more accessible for the formerly enslaved. These black politicians formed coalitions with white Republicans, often called scalawags by their opponents if they were Southerners, or carpetbaggers if they came from the North. Together, this interracial coalition governed the South for much of the Reconstruction era. They weren't perfect, and they faced immense challenges, including internal disagreements and widespread corruption that was common throughout the country at the time. But their very existence was a testament to the possibilities of a multiracial democracy. For a brief, shining moment, the South was governed by some of the most progressive and diverse governments in its history. They were rewriting laws, rebuilding their states, and trying to create a society based on the principle of equality. Of course, this progress did not go unchallenged. The old guard, the white supremacist Democrats who had led the South into secession, were horrified. They viewed black political power as an illegitimate and unnatural disaster. They launched a brutal and violent campaign to overthrow these Reconstruction governments and restore white supremacy. These campaigns, often led by terrorist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, used intimidation, violence, and murder to terrorize black voters and their white allies. They targeted black leaders for assassination, burned schools and churches, and used economic coercion to suppress the black vote. This period of violent redemption, as they called it, systematically dismantled the gains of Reconstruction. By the late 1870s, as the federal government withdrew its troops and its commitment to protecting black rights, these Reconstruction governments fell one by one. The brief but brilliant experiment in interracial democracy was over. It was followed by the long, dark era of Jim Crow, where segregation, voter disenfranchisement, and racial violence would dominate the South for nearly a century. So why is this chapter so important to remember? Because it shows us what was possible. The story of black political participation during Reconstruction is not a story of failure. It's a story of incredible courage, resilience, and vision. These first black lawmakers were pioneers. They proved that African Americans were more than capable of self-government and that a multiracial democracy could work. The legacy of these leaders and the policies they enacted endured, even through the hardships of Jim Crow. The public schools they founded continued to educate generations. The constitutional principles of equality they championed would later be revived by the civil rights movement of the 20th century. When we study this period, we're reminded that progress is never linear. It can be won and then lost, but the ideals and achievements of those who fight for a more just society can never be fully erased. They leave a blueprint for future generations to follow. The story of Hiram Revels, Blanche Bruce, and the thousands of other black officials who served during Reconstruction is a powerful reminder of the enduring struggle for freedom and equality in America. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 15, a truly inspiring chapter titled Education and New Beginnings. This is a story about how knowledge became a beacon of hope, how schools and universities blossomed across the land, and how the simple act of learning transformed countless lives, paving the way for freedom and the pursuit of lifelong dreams. Let's set the stage. Imagine a time when access to education was a privilege, reserved for a select few. For the vast majority, the world of books, ideas, and formal learning was a distant, almost mythical realm. But as societies evolved, a powerful idea began to take root. The idea that education was not just for the elite, but a fundamental tool for progress, for individual growth, and for building a better future. This chapter marks the turning point where that idea started to become a reality. We begin with the remarkable growth of schools. In towns and villages, small schoolhouses started to appear. They were often simple, one-room buildings, but within their walls, Something magical was happening. Children who might have otherwise spent their entire lives in the fields or in manual labor were learning to read, write, and do arithmetic. This was more than just learning skills. It was the opening of a new world. A world of stories, of history, of scientific wonders. For the first time, they could read a newspaper, understand a contract, or write a letter to a loved one far away. This fundamental literacy was the first step on the ladder of opportunity. Teachers, during this period, were true pioneers. They often worked with limited resources, teaching students of all ages in a single classroom. Yet, their dedication was immense. They weren't just imparting knowledge. They were nurturing curiosity, building confidence, and instilling a sense of possibility in their students. They saw the potential in every child, regardless of their background, and they worked tirelessly to unlock it. These early schools became the bedrock of communities, a place where the next generation was forged. As the demand for learning grew, so did the ambition of educational institutions. This brings us to the rise of colleges and universities. These weren't just bigger schools. They were centers of higher learning, of research, and of intellectual debate. They attracted the brightest minds from all over, creating vibrant communities dedicated to pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Fields like medicine, law, engineering, and the arts flourished within these university walls. Future doctors learned the latest medical techniques, saving countless lives. Future lawyers studied principles of justice and fairness, shaping the legal frameworks of their societies. Engineers designed bridges, railways, and buildings that would redefine the landscape and connect people in ways never before possible. And in the humanities, scholars and students alike explored the great questions of philosophy, literature, and art, deepening their understanding of the human experience. Universities became powerful engines of innovation and social change. The ideas that emerged from their lecture halls and laboratories had a ripple effect, influencing everything from government policy to industrial technology. They were not ivory towers, isolated from the world. They were deeply connected to the needs and aspirations of the society they served. They trained the leaders, thinkers, and builders of tomorrow. Now, let us talk about one of the most powerful themes of this chapter: education as a path to freedom. For many, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, education was the key that could unlock the chains of circumstance. It offered a way out of poverty, a chance to break the cycle of generational hardship. Think about it. When you have knowledge, you have choices. You are no longer solely dependent on the circumstances you were born into. You can acquire new skills, seek better employment, and create your own opportunities. This was a revolutionary concept for someone whose family had worked the same plot of land for generations. The ability to become a teacher, a clerk, or an entrepreneur was an incredible form of personal liberation. This freedom wasn't just economic. It was intellectual and personal. Education empowers you to think critically, to question the world around you, and to form your own opinions. It frees you from ignorance and superstition. It gives you the confidence to speak up for yourself and for others, to participate in civic life, and to advocate for change. In this era, learning to read was an act of empowerment. It meant you could read the founding documents of your nation, understand your rights, and hold your leaders accountable. Education, therefore, became intrinsically linked to the ideals of democracy and personal liberty. Finally, and perhaps most beautifully, this chapter is about how lifelong dreams are born in the classroom. Every great journey begins with a single step, and for so many, that first step was taken inside a school. The classroom is a place of discovery. It is where a child might first fall in love with the stars and dream of becoming an astronomer. It's where a student, captivated by a historical story, decides to become a writer to tell tales of their own. It's where a knack for numbers blossoms into a passion for engineering, and a desire to help others solidifies into the ambition to become a doctor or a nurse. These are not just abstract ideas. This period is filled with the stories of real people whose lives were transformed. There's the story of the farmer's son who attended a small village school, went on to university, and became a renowned scientist whose discoveries changed the world. There's the story of the young woman who, against all odds, gained an education and became a powerful voice for social reform, inspiring thousands with her words. The classroom is a crucible where passion meets purpose. It's a space where a teacher's encouragement can ignite a spark that burns for a lifetime. The dreams that began in these humble schoolhouses and grand university halls went on to shape the very fabric of our modern world. The art we admire, the technology we use, the medical care that keeps us healthy so. Many of these achievements can be traced back to a moment of inspiration and a place of learning. As we conclude our look at Chapter 15, Education and New Beginnings, we're left with a powerful message that resonates just as strongly today. The growth of schools and universities was more than just the construction of buildings. It was the construction of a new future. It was the recognition that the greatest resource any society has is the potential of its people. By making education more accessible, society unleashed an unprecedented wave of talent, creativity, and ambition. It affirmed that a person's worth is not determined by their birth, but by their character and their contributions. Education provided the path to freedom from poverty, freedom from ignorance, and the freedom to dream. And it showed us that the most profound and lasting changes often begin in the quiet, hopeful space of a classroom, where a teacher inspires a student, and a new dream takes flight. This chapter is a celebration of teachers, students, and the transformative power of knowledge. It reminds us that investing in education is investing in humanity itself. It's the story of how learning opened the door to a brighter, more hopeful world for everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration. I hope it has given you a new appreciation for the incredible journey of education and the doors it continues to open for all of us. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into our shared past. Until next time, keep learning and keep dreaming. Hey everyone, welcome back to our history series. Today, we're diving deep into Chapter 16, a pivotal moment in the story of American democracy. This chapter is all about one of the most significant and hard-won victories of the Reconstruction era, the fight for voting rights for all men, regardless of their race. So, what's the big deal about Chapter 16? It centers on the ratification of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Ratified in 1870, this amendment states, and I'll quote it directly because its words are so powerful: "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Think about that for a second. For the first time in American history, the Constitution explicitly protected the right to vote for African American men. This was a monumental leap forward. After centuries of slavery and oppression, this amendment was supposed to be the key that unlocked true citizenship and political power for millions of newly freed people. It was a promise of a more inclusive and representative democracy, a nation living up to its founding ideals of liberty and justice for all. Imagine the atmosphere at the time. There were massive celebrations in black communities across the country. Parades marched through the streets of cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. Frederick Douglass, one of the most prominent abolitionists and orators of the era, called the amendment a nation's guarantee that the sacrifices of the Civil War were not in vain. He saw it as the culmination of the abolitionist movement, the final step in securing freedom. During this brief period of hope, often called radical Reconstruction, the impact was immediate and profound. Hundreds of thousands of black men registered to vote across the South. They weren't just casting ballots. They were actively participating in the political process. They organized, they attended political conventions, and they ran for office. And they won. For the first time ever, African Americans were elected to local, state, and even national positions. We saw black sheriffs, mayors, and state legislators. In South Carolina, the state with the largest black population, African Americans even held a majority in the lower house of the state legislature for a time. At the federal level, 16 African American men served in the U.S. Congress during Reconstruction, including Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, who both represented Mississippi in the U.S. Senate. This was democracy in action. These newly elected officials worked to establish public education systems for all children, both black and white. They worked to rebuild the war-torn infrastructure of the South and passed laws to protect civil rights. They were proving that a multiracial democracy was not only possible but beneficial for everyone. This period was a testament to what could be achieved when the promise of the 15th Amendment was embraced. It was a true milestone, a beacon of progress that showed the world what America could be. So, if the 15th Amendment was such a landmark achievement, why did the struggle for voting rights continue for another century? This is the tragic and frustrating part of the story. And that's where we see why laws on paper are not always the same as reality on the ground. The promise of the amendment was powerful, but the forces opposing it were just as determined. The problem was enforcement. The amendment itself gave Congress the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, but the will to do so quickly faded. As the 1870s wore on, the federal government began to retreat from its commitment to protecting the rights of African Americans in the South. Why? Well, there were a few reasons. The nation was growing weary of the costs and conflicts of Reconstruction. A severe economic depression in 1873 shifted the public's focus to financial matters. And frankly, a tide of racism was rising again, both in the North and the South. This retreat created a power vacuum, and it was filled by those who wanted to restore white supremacy. Southern states, now back under the control of white-dominated Democratic parties, began a systematic campaign to disenfranchise black voters. They could only legally pass a law that said black people could vote, because the 15th Amendment forbade that. So, they got creative in the most sinister ways. They devised a whole toolbox of discriminatory practices, often called the Jim Crow laws. First, there were poll taxes. These were fees that people had to pay in order to vote. While they sounded neutral, they were designed to be a barrier for impoverished people, which included a large number of formerly enslaved African Americans and poor white farmers. If you couldn't afford the tax, you couldn't vote. Then came the literacy tests. Again, these sound reasonable on the surface. Right, we want educated voters. But the reality was far from it. These tests were administered in a completely biased way. A white voter might be asked to simply write their name. In contrast, a black voter would be given a complex passage of the state constitution and asked to interpret it to the satisfaction of a white registrar, who held all the power to pass or fail them. These tests were often impossible to pass, designed specifically to exclude. And if that wasn't enough, there were the grandfather clauses. These were truly cynical legal loopholes. They stated that if your grandfather had been eligible to vote before the Civil War, which, of course, no enslaved person's grandfather was then, you were exempt from the poll taxes and literacy tests. This was a clear and direct way to allow illiterate and poor white men to vote while barring almost all African Americans. Beyond these legal tricks, there was the constant threat of violence and intimidation. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations used terror to keep black people away from the polls. They would harass, beat, and even lynch people who dared to register to vote or assert their political rights. Economic intimidation was also common. A black sharecropper who tried to vote could find himself evicted from his land, and a black business owner could be boycotted into bankruptcy. The Supreme Court, unfortunately, did little to help. In a series of rulings in the late 19th century, the court interpreted the 15th Amendment very narrowly. They ruled that the amendment didn't actually guarantee every citizen the right to vote. It just prevented states from denying it on the basis of race. This meant that all those other barriers, poll taxes, literacy tests were deemed constitutional, as long as they didn't explicitly mention race. This effectively gutted the amendment's power and gave a green light to southern states to continue their disenfranchisement campaigns. So, by the turn of the 20th century, the promise of Chapter 16 and the 15th Amendment had been almost completely erased in the South. Black voter registration plummeted. The story of Chapter 16 is therefore a lesson in both the power of law and its limitations. It shows us that progress is not a straight line. A milestone victory can be won, but it must be constantly defended. It took nearly another 100 years, with the rise of the Civil Rights Movement and the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, to finally begin to realize the original promise of the 15th Amendment. That landmark act finally outlawed the discriminatory voting practices we've talked about and gave the federal government the tools it needed for enforcement. So, as we wrap up our look at Chapter 16, it's important to remember both the triumph and the tragedy. The 15th Amendment was a radical and righteous step forward, a foundational piece of a more perfect union, but the long and difficult struggle to enforce it reminds us that rights are never truly secure, unless we are all vigilant in protecting them. The fight for fair and equal access to the ballot box, which began in the era of Reconstruction, continues to be a central issue in American politics today. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into a crucial chapter of American history. I hope it gave you a lot to think about. If you found this interesting, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss our next video. We'll see you in the next one. Welcome back to our series on American history. Today, we're diving deep into a landmark moment, a pivotal chapter in the long and often difficult story of democracy in the United States. Chapter 17, the 15th Amendment. So, what exactly is the 15th Amendment? Ratified on February 3, 1870, its core principle is stated in just 2 short sections. Section 1 declares, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Think about that for a moment. After centuries of slavery and the brutal Civil War, the Constitution was fundamentally changed to prohibit racial discrimination in voting. It was a revolutionary idea, a monumental step forward. For the first time, the highest law of the land explicitly protected the right to vote for African American men. This was a direct result of the Reconstruction era, the period after the Civil War aimed at rebuilding the South and integrating newly freed slaves into American society. The passage of this amendment was a cause for a massive celebration. Parades were held in cities across the country. People saw it as the fulfillment of the nation's promise of liberty and justice for all. It felt like the final, triumphant chapter of the fight for emancipation. In theory, it meant that millions of men, who were once considered property, could now walk into a polling place and have a say in their own governance, to elect sheriffs, mayors, and even members of Congress. And for a brief period, this promise started to become a reality. During Reconstruction, African Americans not only voted in large numbers, but also held political office at local, state, and even federal levels. It was a breathtaking transformation. Imagine going from being enslaved one day to serving in the legislature the next. This period saw the election of black congressmen, senators, and thousands of other officials who began to reshape the political landscape of the South. They advocated for public education, fair labor laws, and infrastructure improvements that would benefit all citizens, regardless of race. This was democracy in action, a powerful testament to the potential of the 15th Amendment. However, the story doesn't end there. The amendment had a critical weakness. While it said that states couldn't deny the vote based on race, it didn't explicitly outlaw other methods of disenfranchisement, and this loophole would be ruthlessly exploited. As Reconstruction came to an end in 1877 and federal troops were withdrawn from the South, the political will to enforce the 15th Amendment evaporated. The old power structures in the South were determined to regain control and reestablish a system of white supremacy. They couldn't legally say, "You can't vote because you're black," but they found other ways to achieve the same results. This led to the rise of Jim Crow laws and a host of discriminatory practices designed to keep African Americans from the polls. States implemented poll taxes, which required people to pay a fee to vote. For many former slaves and poor sharecroppers, this was an insurmountable barrier. They also introduced literacy tests. These weren't fair assessments of reading ability. Election officials would often ask black voters to read and interpret incredibly complex legal documents or obscure passages of the Constitution, while white voters were given simple sentences or weren't tested at all. Another tactic was the grandfather clause. This provision stated that if your grandfather had the right to vote before the Civil War, you are exempt from poll taxes and literacy tests. Of course, this conveniently excluded virtually all African Americans, whose grandfathers had been enslaved and had no voting rights. Beyond these legalistic tricks, there was the constant threat of violence and intimidation. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror to scare black citizens away from registering to vote or showing up on election day. Lynchings, beatings, and threats against families were common tactics. The message was clear. Attempting to exercise your constitutional right to vote could cost you your life. As a result of these concerted efforts, black voter participation in the South plummeted. By the early 20th century, the number of registered African American voters had dropped by tens, even hundreds of thousands. In many states, it was near zero. The promise of the 15th Amendment had been effectively nullified. The vibrant political participation seen during Reconstruction was crushed, and an entire population was once again silenced. It's a stark reminder that passing a law is one thing, but enforcing it and changing the hearts and minds of people is another challenge altogether. The struggle for true voting rights was far from over. It would take nearly another century of activism, court battles, and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s to begin to undo the damage of Jim Crow. The landmark Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the legislation that finally gave the 15th Amendment the teeth it needed. It outlawed literacy tests, provided for federal oversight of voter registration in areas with a history of discrimination, and made it possible for the federal government to challenge poll taxes. It was this act that truly began to restore the promise of 1870. So, the 15th Amendment stands as a critical milestone, a beacon of democratic ideals, but its history is also a cautionary tale. It teaches us that rights on paper are not always rights in practice. It shows us that democracy is not a destination, but a continuous struggle. It requires constant vigilance, courage, and a commitment to ensuring that every citizen's voice can be heard. The fight for fair access to the ballot box continues to this day, with debates over voter ID laws, polling place closures, and voter registration processes. Understanding the history of the 15th Amendment, its incredible promise, and its tragic betrayal is essential for understanding the ongoing conversation about who gets to participate in American democracy. It's a story of hope, struggle, and the enduring power of the vote. Thanks for watching! If you found this video insightful, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into history, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next chapter. Hello everyone and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into Chapter 18, which is all about the tough economic realities faced by the South after the Civil War. It's a story of hope, struggle, and a system that in many ways replaced one form of bondage with another. So, let's get into it. The Civil War had left the Southern economy in absolute ruins. Plantations were destroyed, infrastructure was gone, and the entire labor system built on slavery had been dismantled. So the big question was, what comes next? How do you rebuild an entire society from the ground up? A major piece of this puzzle was land. For the nearly 4 million newly freed African Americans, owning land was the ultimate symbol of freedom. It meant independence, the ability to provide for their families, and a chance to finally build a life of their own, free from the control of white landowners. This idea of 40 acres and a mule became a powerful symbol. It originated from General Sherman's Special Field Order, No. 15, which set aside a massive tract of land along the coast of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida for settlement by freed families. For a brief moment, it looked like a genuine land reform was possible. Imagine thousands of families finally getting a piece of the American dream they had been denied for so long. But, and this is a huge but, this dream was short-lived. President Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln's assassination, had very different ideas. He was a Southerner himself and was much more sympathetic to the old planter class. He quickly pardoned many former Confederates and, most devastatingly, he reversed Sherman's order. He ordered that the land be returned to its original white owners. This was a crushing blow to the hopes of freed people. The federal government had essentially promised a new beginning and then snatched it away, leaving millions of African Americans with freedom in name, but with very few resources to actually build a free life. Without land, what were their options? This is where the system of sharecropping comes into the picture. With no land of their own and few other job opportunities, most freedmen, and even many poor white farmers had no choice but to return to the very plantations where they had once been enslaved. But now, instead of being slaves, they became sharecroppers. On the surface, it looked like a step up. A landowner would divide their property into smaller plots and rent them out to a family. In exchange for the land, seeds, tools, and sometimes food and clothing, the family would give the landowner a share of their crop at the end of the year, usually around half. It sounded like a fair deal, right? A way for families to work for themselves and have some autonomy. But the reality was far from it. The system was designed from the start to keep the sharecroppers in a state of perpetual debt. First, the landowners and local merchants, who were often the same person, set the prices for the supplies they loaned to the sharecroppers. These prices were incredibly high. Then, when it was time to sell the crop, the landowner would also control the sale and determine its value, often undervaluing it. Let's walk through how this cycle of debt worked. A sharecropper family starts the year with zero money. They get land, seeds, and tools from the landowner on credit. Throughout the year, they have to buy food, clothing, and other necessities from the landowner's store, also on credit, at inflated prices. At the end of the harvest, let's say they produce a crop worth $200. The landowner takes his half, which is $100. But then, the landowner presents a bill for all the supplies and food the family bought on credit. Thanks to those high prices and interest rates, that bill might come to $110. So, at the end of a long, hard year of work, the family not only has no profit, but they are now $10 in debt to the landowner. This is called debt peer, and because they are in debt, they are legally required to stay on the land and work for another year to pay it off. But of course, the same thing happens the next year, and the debt just gets deeper and deeper. It was a trap, a brilliant and cruel system that ensured a stable, cheap labor force for the cotton and tobacco plantations, without the legal title of slavery. This system affected everyone in the rural South, while it was particularly devastating for African Americans, trapping them in a system that mirrored slavery. Many poor white farmers also got caught in the same cycle of debt. The post-war South did not become a land of opportunity for most. Instead, it became a region defined by widespread poverty, with a small, wealthy elite of landowners and merchants at the top, and a vast population of black and white farmers trapped at the bottom, unable to escape the crushing weight of debt. This economic structure had huge social and political consequences. Because the landowners held all the economic power, they also held all the political power. They could intimidate sharecroppers, control their votes, and use their economic leverage to enforce the strict racial hierarchy of the Jim Crow South. The dream of economic independence for African Americans was systematically denied, which in turn made it nearly impossible for them to achieve true social or political equality. The failure of land reform and the rise of sharecropping are absolutely critical to understanding the history of the South after the Civil War. It explains why poverty persisted in the region for generations, and why the struggle for civil rights would be such a long and difficult one. It shows that abolishing slavery was just the first step. Without a real plan for economic justice, the old structures of power and exploitation simply found new ways to survive and adapt. And so, as we move forward in our studies, it's important to remember this economic foundation. The political battles, the social segregation, all of it is connected back to this fundamental struggle over land, labor, and economic power in the post-war South. The legacy of sharecropping and debt peonage shaped the region for nearly a century, and its echoes can still be felt today. Thanks for watching this deep dive into Chapter 18. I know it's a heavy topic, but it's so important for understanding American history. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next video. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series on American history. Today, we're diving into a crucial, yet often overlooked, chapter, the waning years of Reconstruction and the rise of what historians call Reconstruction fatigue in the North. After the immense sacrifices of the Civil War, the nation embarked on a bold, unprecedented experiment to rebuild the South and integrate 4 million newly freed African Americans into the fabric of American life. The early years were filled with a sense of moral purpose and radical change. But by the 1870s, that initial wave of idealism began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of weariness and impatience. So, what happened? Why did the North, which had fought so fiercely to end slavery and preserve the Union, begin to lose its appetite for the difficult work of Reconstruction? That's the central question we'll explore today. It wasn't one single event, but a combination of factors that gradually eroded Northern support. Imagine you're an average voter in Ohio or Pennsylvania in the early 1870s. 4 years. You've been hearing about the ongoing turmoil in the South. Federal troops are still stationed there, propping up new Republican governments that are constantly under attack from white supremacists, groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Every election cycle brings news of violence, intimidation, and political chaos. The initial hope for a swift and peaceful transformation of the South had given way to the reality of a long, costly, and seemingly endless struggle. People started to ask, when will this ever end? Haven't we done enough? This growing impatience was a major driver of Reconstruction fatigue. The newspapers of the day played a huge role in shaping this perception. While some continued to report on the atrocities faced by black Southerners, many others started to paint a different picture. They began to portray the Southern Republican governments, which included black office holders, as corrupt and incompetent. This narrative of misrule and carpetbagger greed, was incredibly effective. It shifted the blame for the South's problems away from the former Confederates who were actively resisting Reconstruction and onto the very people trying to implement it. Northerners, many of whom still harbored their own racial prejudices, found this narrative easy to accept. It fed into a growing sentiment that perhaps the federal government had gone too far in its attempts to re-engineer Southern society. The idea that Black Americans were not ready for the full rights of citizenship, a deeply racist belief, started to regain traction. Instead of seeing federal intervention as a necessary protection for freedom, more and more Northerners began to see it as an unnatural and failing experiment. But it wasn't just about politics and prejudice. The economy played a massive, perhaps even decisive, role. The early 1870s were a time of massive industrial growth, railroad expansion, and westward migration. The nation's attention was shifting. People were more interested in building factories, settling new lands, and making money than they were in the seemingly intractable problems of the South. The focus was on the future, on economic progress, not on resolving the legacies of the past. Then, in 1873, disaster struck. The Panic of 1873 plunged the nation into a severe economic depression that would last for years. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment skyrocketed. Suddenly, the average Northern voter had much more immediate concerns than the rights of freedmen in faraway states. Their own economic survival was on the line. They were worried about feeding their families and finding work. In this climate of economic crisis, the continued cost of stationing troops in the South and funding federal programs seemed like an unaffordable luxury. Economic self-interest began to eclipse the moral commitments of the previous decade. People demanded that the government focused on fixing the economy at home, not on policing the South. This economic anxiety created a perfect storm for a political shift. The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln and emancipation, had been the driving force behind Reconstruction. But by the mid-1870s, the party itself was changing. The old guard of radical Republicans, passionate abolitionists like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner who had championed civil rights, were either dying out or losing influence. A new generation of leaders emerged, often more aligned with the interests of big business and industrial capitalism. They were pragmatists, not moral crusaders. Their priorities were economic, tariffs, currency, and railroad subsidies. They saw the Southern question as a political liability, a distraction that was costing them votes. The constant turmoil in the South was hurting the party's image and draining its resources. To these new leaders, abandoning the cause of black civil rights in the South seemed like a small price to pay for national unity and economic unity defined, of course, on the terms of white Americans North and South. The congressional elections of 1874 were a turning point. For the first time since before the Civil War, Democrats won control of the House of Representatives. It was a massive political earthquake, a clear signal that the public mood had shifted. The election was a referendum on the Republican-led Reconstruction, and the verdict was clear. The people were tired of it. This Democratic victory crippled the federal government's ability to enforce Reconstruction policies. With a divided Congress, passing new civil rights legislation, or even funding existing enforcement efforts became nearly impossible. The message to white Southerners was unmistakable. The federal government was losing its will to intervene. Emboldened by this, Redeemer Democrats in the South, who are openly committed to restoring white supremacy, launched a new wave of violence and intimidation to overthrow the remaining Republican state governments. The so-called Mississippi Plan of 1875, which used organized violence to suppress the black vote and ensure a Democratic victory, became a model for other states. The federal government, weakened and unwilling to commit to another major military intervention, did little to stop it. The final nail in the coffin of Reconstruction came with the disputed presidential election of 1876. The race between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden was one of the most contentious in American history, with disputed electoral votes from 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 20, the election of 1876. A story so wild it makes modern political dramas look tame. This wasn't just another election. It was a moment that brought the United States to the very brink of a second civil war, just a decade after the first one ended. The air was thick with tension. The wounds of the war were still fresh, and the future of the nation hung precariously in the balance. So, let's set the stage. It's 1876, America's centennial year. The country is celebrating 100 years of independence. But beneath the patriotic parades and celebrations, deep divisions simmered. President Ulysses S. Grant's administration was winding down, plagued by scandal and corruption. The public was tired of the spoils system and the seemingly endless reports of graft. The nation was grappling with the massive undertaking of Reconstruction in the South, and economic anxieties were high following the Panic of 1873. People were desperate for change, for a leader who could restore faith in the government and heal the country's fractured soul. The Republican Party, which had dominated national politics since Lincoln, was on the defensive. They nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor of Ohio. Hayes was a solid choice. He was a Union general, respected for his integrity, and seen as a reformer who could clean up the corruption that had tainted the Grant years. He represented a safe, steady hand. His platform promised to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans and continue the project of Reconstruction, while also pledging civil service reform. On the other side, the Democratic Party saw a golden opportunity. They had been slowly regaining power, especially in the South, where they were known as the Redeemers, determined to end Republican rule and federal oversight. Their nominee was Samuel J. Tilden, the governor of New York. Tilden was a star. He had made a national name for himself by taking down the corrupt Tweed Ring in New York City. He was the ultimate reform candidate, promising to slash wasteful government spending and, most importantly, to end the federal military occupation of the South. His message resonated with voters who were tired of conflict and yearned for reconciliation, even if that reconciliation came at a terrible cost for black Southerners. The campaign was fierce. Republicans waved the bloody shirt, reminding voters that the Democrats were the party of rebellion and they painted a picture of what might happen if the old Confederacy regained power. Democrats, in turn, hammered the Republicans on corruption and the failures of Reconstruction. They argued that federal intervention in the South was a costly, unconstitutional overreach that was preventing the nation from truly moving on. As election night approached on November 7, 1876, the country held its breath. When the initial returns started coming in, it looked like a clear victory for Samuel Tilden. He was leading in the popular vote by a comfortable margin of about 250,000 votes. Newspapers across the country began printing headlines, declaring him the next president. Tilden had captured 184 electoral votes, just one shy of the 185 needed to win the presidency outright. Hayes, on the other hand, had 165. It seemed all but over. The Democrats were celebrating what they believed was their triumphant return to the White House for the first time in 2 decades. But then, things got complicated. In the chaotic post-war South, the election process was far from perfect. There were widespread allegations of voter intimidation, fraud, and violence from both sides, and the results from 4 states, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon, were in dispute. Let's break down the chaos. In Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, the 3 southern states still under Republican control and federal military protection, the situation was a mess. Both parties claimed victory. Democratic-leaning paramilitary groups, like the Red Shirts and the White League, had used violence and intimidation to suppress the black Republican vote. In response, Republican-controlled returning boards, which had the power to certify the vote, threw out thousands of Democratic ballots, citing fraud and voter intimidation. Suddenly, these states, which initially appeared to go for Tilden, were declared for Hayes. The Democrats were furious. They cried foul, accusing the Republicans of stealing the election. They set up their own rival state governments and sent their own competing slates of electoral votes to Washington. So, for Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, Congress received 2 completely different sets of results, one for Hayes and one for Tilden. Then there was Oregon. Oregon had gone for Hayes, but one of its electors, a man named John Watts, was found to be technically ineligible because he was a postmaster, a federal office holder. The Democratic governor of Oregon replaced him with a Democratic elector. So now, even one of Hayes's electoral votes was in question. This created an unprecedented constitutional crisis. The Constitution provided no clear guidance on how to resolve a situation where multiple sets of electoral votes were submitted from the same state. who had the authority to decide which votes were valid. The Republican-controlled Senate, the Democratic-controlled House of Representatives. The nation was on a knife's edge. For weeks, the presidency remained undecided. Talk of war filled the air. People began forming armed militias. A Democratic newspaper headline screamed, "Tilden! W.A.R." President Grant quietly reinforced the military presence around Washington, D.C., fearing an outbreak of violence. It felt like the country was about to splinter all over again. The centennial year, which had begun with such hope, was ending in bitter, dangerous uncertainty. To solve this crisis and pull the country back from the brink, Congress had to get creative. They formed a special electoral commission in January 1877. This commission was supposed to be an impartial body designed to settle the dispute. It was made up of 15 members, 5 from the House of Representatives, 5 from the Senate, and 5 from the Supreme Court. The commission was designed to be politically balanced. The House appointed 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. The Senate appointed 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. That made for 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans. The deciding vote was supposed to come from the judiciary. The plan was to have 2 Republican justices, 2 Democratic justices, and 1 independent justice, David Davis. Davis was widely respected and seen as the only one who could be a neutral arbiter. But, in a final, dramatic twist, just as the commission was being formed, the Illinois legislature elected David Davis to the Senate. He resigned from the Supreme Court and the commission. His replacement had to be another Supreme Court justice, and all the remaining justices were staunch Republicans. The new 15th member was Justice Joseph P. Bradley. Despite hopes that Bradley might be independent, the commission ultimately voted along strict party lines on every single disputed vote. By a vote of 8-7, the commission awarded all 20 disputed electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and even the contested one from Oregon, to Rutherford B. Hayes. The final electoral tally became 185 for Hayes and 184 for Tilden. Hayes had won the presidency by a single electoral vote, despite losing the popular vote by 250,000. The Democrats were enraged. They felt the election had been stolen by a corrupt bargain. They threatened to filibuster the official counting of the votes in Congress to prevent Hayes from being inaugurated. The country was once again staring into the abyss. What happened next is one of the most controversial and consequential moments in American history, known today as the Compromise of 1877. With the deadline for inauguration looming, key leaders from both parties met in secret to hammer out a deal. The details were negotiated behind closed doors, reportedly at the Wormley Hotel in Washington, D.C. Here is the deal they struck. The Democrats agreed to accept Hayes as the legitimate president and stop their filibuster. In exchange, the Republicans, represented by Hayes's allies, made a series of crucial promises. The most significant promise was to withdraw all remaining federal troops from the South. This would effectively end the era of Reconstruction and hand control of the southern states completely over to the white Democratic Redeemers. The deal also included promises to appoint at least 1 Southern Democrat to Hayes's cabinet, to support federal funding for internal improvements in the South, like a transcontinental railroad, and to generally adopt a policy of non-interference in Southern affairs. On March 2, 1877, just 2 days before Inauguration Day, the deal was done. Congress officially certified the electoral votes, and Rutherford B. Hayes was declared the 19th President of the United States. The immediate crisis was averted. There would be no second civil war. But the price of this peace was devastatingly high. The Compromise of 1877 was effectively a betrayal of the promises of emancipation and racial equality that had emerged from the Civil War. Once federal troops were withdrawn, the Republican state governments in the South quickly collapsed. The Redeemer Democrats took full control. Without federal protection, African Americans in the South were left at the mercy of their former masters. The progress made during Reconstruction was systematically dismantled. Southern states began passing Jim Crow laws, enforcing strict racial segregation. They implemented poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses to disenfranchise black voters, effectively stripping them of their political power for nearly a century. The era of Jim Crow, segregation, and state-sanctioned racial oppression began in earnest. So, while the election of 1876 and the subsequent compromise saved the Union from another immediate conflict, It did so by sacrificing the rights and freedoms of millions of African Americans. It resolved a short-term political crisis, but created a long-term moral and social catastrophe that would define the American South for generations to come. The story of 1876 is a powerful and sobering lesson. It shows us how fragile democracy can be, how close the nation came to another violent rupture, and the profound and lasting consequences of political deals made in back rooms. It marks a major turning point in American history, a moment when the nation chose sectional reconciliation over racial justice, ending one chapter of its history only to begin another, darker one. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the chaotic and consequential election of 1876. It's a crucial piece of the American puzzle. If you found this interesting, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. We'll see you next time. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into American history. Today, we're tackling a pivotal and honestly, a pretty controversial moment. The Compromise of 1877. Have you ever wondered how the era of Reconstruction, this massive effort to rebuild the South and integrate millions of formerly enslaved people into society, just ended? It wasn't with a grand declaration or a final victory. It ended with a political deal, a backroom bargain that would change the course of the nation for the next century. So, grab your notebooks, get comfortable, and let's unravel the story of the compromise that officially closed the book on Reconstruction. To really understand the Compromise of 1877, we have to set the stage with the presidential election of 1876. It was one of the most disputed and intense elections in American history. On one side, you had the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor of Ohio. On the other, the Democrat, Samuel J. Tilden, the governor of New York. When the election results came in, things got messy. Really messy. Really messy. Tilden had clearly won the popular vote by about 250,000 votes. But the presidency isn't decided by the popular vote. It's decided by the Electoral College. And that's where the trouble began. Tilden was just one electoral vote shy of the 185 he needed to win. But the electoral votes from 3 southern states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, were in dispute. Both parties claimed victory in those states. Think about the chaos of the 2000 election with Florida, and then multiply that by 3, and add in the raw, post-Civil War tensions. Both sides accused the other of fraud, voter intimidation, and outright stealing the election. It was a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. The country was on edge. There were even fears that another civil war could break out. So, how do you solve a problem like this? Congress had to step in. They created a special electoral commission to decide the outcome. This commission was made up of 15 members, 5 from the House of Representatives, 5 from the Senate, and 5 from the Supreme Court. It was supposed to be balanced, with 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent Supreme Court Justice, David Davis. But, in a classic political twist, just before the commission started its work, Davis was elected to the Senate by the Illinois legislature and resigned from the commission. His replacement was a Republican justice, Joseph P. Bradley. This tipped the commission's balance to an 8-7 Republican majority. And surprise, surprise, in every disputed case, the commission voted 8-7 along party lines to award all the contested electoral votes to the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes. Just like that, Hayes was poised to become the next president, even though he had lost the popular vote and the initial electoral count was murky at best. Naturally, the Democrats were furious. They felt the presidency had been stolen from them. They threatened to block the official certification of the election in Congress through filibusters and other procedural delays. The nation held its breath. The government was paralyzed, and the inauguration date was approaching fast. This is where the compromise part of the story comes in. Behind closed doors, away from the public eye, prominent Republicans and powerful Southern Democrats started talking. They needed to find a way to break the deadlock and avoid plunging the country back into chaos. The Southern Democrats knew they probably couldn't get Tilden into the White House, but they saw an opportunity. They had leverage. What did they want in exchange for letting Hayes become president peacefully? The answer would shape the future of the American South for generations. The Southern Democrats had one primary demand: the end of Reconstruction. Specifically, They wanted the complete withdrawal of all federal troops from the South. These troops had been stationed in states like South Carolina and Louisiana since the end of the Civil War. Their presence was a symbol of federal authority, and, crucially, they were there to protect the civil and voting rights of African Americans against violence and suppression from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. For many white Southerners, these troops were an occupying army, a constant reminder of their defeat in the war. For Republicans, especially the radical Republicans who had championed Reconstruction, the troops were the only thing guaranteeing the fragile gains made in civil rights. But by 1877, many Northerners were tired of the Southern question. They were weary of the constant conflict, the expense of maintaining the military presence, and they wanted to move on and focus on economic issues. So, the deal was struck. It wasn't a formal, written treaty, but an unwritten, informal agreement. The Democrats would stop blocking Hayes' certification and allow him to become president. In return, the Republicans, under President Hayes, promised to pull the last remaining federal troops out of the South. But that wasn't all. The deal also included promises of federal money for internal improvements in the South, like railroads and infrastructure, to help rebuild their economy. And, significantly, it included a promise to appoint at least one Southern Democrat to Hayes' cabinet. This was a signal that the federal government would adopt a hands-off approach to Southern affairs. In essence, the Republican Party was trading the presidency for the abandonment of its commitment to protecting African American rights in the South. It was a political calculation of the highest order. True to his word, shortly after his inauguration in March 1877, President Hayes ordered the last federal troops to stand down and return to their barracks in South Carolina and Louisiana. The remaining Republican-led state governments in the South, which had relied on that federal protection, quickly collapsed. White Democrats, many of whom were former Confederates who called themselves Redeemers, swept back into power across the region, with the federal government no longer enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments. These new Southern governments were free to act. And they did. The Compromise of 1877 effectively gave them a green light to dismantle the progress of Reconstruction. It marked the definitive end of the era. The federal experiment in protecting the rights of its newly freed citizens was over. The consequences of this compromise were immediate and devastating for African Americans in the South. The Redeemer governments began systematically disenfranchising black voters. They implemented poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, all designed to prevent African Americans from exercising their right to vote. Segregation, which had existed informally, was now codified into law, creating the system we know as Jim Crow. This system enforced strict racial separation in every aspect of life, from schools and hospitals to trains and water fountains. The promise of equality that had been born out of the Civil War was broken. The withdrawal of federal troops removed the only real protection against the terror and violence of white supremacist groups, and a new era of racial oppression began, one that would last for nearly another century. So, when we look back at the Compromise of 1877, it's crucial to see it for what it was. It was a political deal that resolved a constitutional crisis and averted potential conflict, but it came at an immense cost. It sacrificed the rights and safety of millions of African Americans for the sake of national unity and political stability among white Americans. It effectively ended the nation's first major attempt at building a biracial democracy. The end of Reconstruction wasn't just a policy shift. It was the start of a long, dark period in American history, the effects of which we are still grappling with today. It serves as a powerful reminder of how political bargains made in secret can have profound and lasting impacts on the lives of ordinary people and the very soul of a nation. Thanks so much for watching. I know this was a heavy topic, but it's an essential piece of our shared history. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What other moments in history do you think were defined by a backroom deal? I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video. Hey everybody, welcome back to our deep dive into American history. Today, we re-tackling a topic that is arguably one of the most misunderstood and yet most consequential periods in the nation's past. The legacy of Reconstruction. It's the story of what happened after the Civil War ended. A chapter filled with soaring hopes, bitter disappointments, and a revolution that was left unfinished. So, what did Reconstruction actually accomplish? And where did it fall short? Let's find out. The era of Reconstruction, roughly from 1865 to 1877, was America's first attempt to build an interracial democracy out of the ashes of slavery. On one hand, the achievements were monumental. For the first time, African American men were granted the right to vote and hold political office. Hundreds were elected to local and state positions, and 16 even served in the U.S. Congress. This was a breathtaking transformation. Public school systems were established for all children, black and white, throughout the South. Many, for the very first time, laws were rewritten to be more equitable. And perhaps, most importantly, the nation ratified 3 transformative constitutional amendments. These are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, often called the Reconstruction Amendments, and their impact is impossible to overstate. They are the bedrock of modern civil rights in America. The 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery, ending a system that had defined the nation for centuries. The 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote, a cornerstone of citizenship. But it's the 14th Amendment that has truly become a pillar of American law. It granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the laws. Think about that phrase, equal protection. It's the legal foundation for landmark Supreme Court cases like Brown v. Board of Education, which desegregated schools, and countless other civil rights battles that continue to this day. These amendments were a radical redefinition of what it meant to be an American. However, for every step forward, there seemed to be a violent pushback. The failures of Reconstruction are just as stark as its achievements. The promise of economic independence for formerly enslaved people, often summarized by the phrase 40 acres and a mule, never materialized. A system of sharecropping quickly trapped many black families, as well as poor white families, in a cycle of debt and poverty that was little better than slavery. The federal government's commitment to protecting the rights of its new black citizens faltered. As political will in the North waned, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. This created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, who used terror, violence, and intimidation to suppress black voting and reestablish a racial hierarchy. This campaign of terror was devastatingly effective. Alongside violence, Southern states began enacting a series of discriminatory laws known as black codes, which later evolved into the Jim Crow system. These laws enforced strict racial segregation and stripped away the political and economic gains African Americans had made. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were all legal tricks designed to disenfranchise black voters, effectively nullifying the 15th Amendment in the South for nearly a century. The federal government, once the protector of freedmen's rights, largely turned a blind eye. The Supreme Court even chipped away at the protections of the 14th Amendment in cases like Plessy v. Ferguson, which established the infamous separate but equal doctrine that legalized segregation. So, why is Reconstruction often called an unfinished chapter? Because the central questions of the era were left unresolved. What is the true meaning of freedom? What is the federal government's role in protecting the rights of all its citizens? And how does a nation heal from centuries of racial injustice? The end of Reconstruction in 1877 didn't answer these questions. It merely postponed them. The promises of equality made in the 14th and 15th Amendments were deferred, not denied. And it would take another 100 years for the civil rights movement to rise up and demand that the nation finally live up to them. The civil rights activists of the 1950s and 60s saw themselves as finishing the work that the radical Republicans had started a century earlier. The legacy of Reconstruction, therefore, is a complex mix of triumph and tragedy. It was a bold, noble experiment in biracial democracy that was tragically cut short. It gave us constitutional amendments that remain powerful tools for justice, but it also showed the deep-seated resistance to racial equality in America. It's a reminder that progress is not linear and that rights, once won, must be constantly defended. Understanding this period is crucial to understanding the ongoing struggles for justice and equality in the United States today. The debates we have about voting rights, systemic inequality, and the meaning of citizenship are not new. They are echoes of the unfinished business of Reconstruction. It's a chapter of our history that continues to shape our present and our future. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this gave you a clearer picture of this pivotal time in American history. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the past. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.